Hi everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Evan Crime Stories. I'm Evan, and I'll be your narrator tonight. Tonight's story is a true RV camping crime story involving real people and real events. If you're listening as you fall asleep, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy the story, please like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. We share these stories to remember the victims and learn from the warning signs. And tonight, you can relax knowing this is a completely ad-free story with no interruptions. So lower the volume, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let tonight's true crime story begin. Story 1. There are places where the night feels different. Not frightening exactly, just quiet. The kind of quiet where you become aware of sounds you would normally never notice. The wind moving through the trees, a branch rubbing against another branch, the occasional call of a distant animal, the soft ticking of a cooling engine. And when you are alone in the middle of a forest, those small sounds can become surprisingly loud. That was what made the campsite feel so peaceful at first. There was no traffic, no nearby houses, no streetlights, no television noise coming through another apartment. Just trees, miles and miles of them. And somewhere among those trees was a small clearing where one RV had been parked for the night. The trip had been planned as a quiet escape. Nothing complicated, no crowded campground, no busy tourist destination, just a few days away from the city. The kind of trip people take when they want to disappear for a little while. During the day, the forest was beautiful. Sunlight came through the branches in long, pale beams. Birds moved between the trees. The road leading into the area was narrow and uneven, but that was part of the attraction. The farther the RV traveled from the main highway, the less civilization seemed to exist. Eventually, even the sound of traffic disappeared. The only road left was a rough gravel path surrounded by forest. The campsite itself was not completely primitive. There was a small fire ring, a wooden picnic table, a metal trash container, and a narrow trail leading toward a stream somewhere beyond the trees. There were supposed to be other campers in the area, but that afternoon, none were visible. The nearest occupied campsite appeared to be several hundred yards away, perhaps even farther. It was close enough that someone could theoretically hear a loud shout, but far enough that ordinary conversation would disappear into the forest. That distance would become important later. The RV was parked with its front facing the narrow road. The rear pointed toward the trees. Inside, everything was ordinary. A small kitchen, a narrow bed, a table that could be folded down, a refrigerator humming quietly, a few bags, a flashlight, a phone charging near the bed. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the night would become memorable. Before sunset, the camper walked around the site. They checked the doors, locked the storage compartments, moved a few things inside. Then they started a small fire. The flames were low. There was no need for anything large, just enough light to sit outside for a while. The forest slowly changed as daylight disappeared. Green became gray. Gray became black, and the spaces between the trees became impossible to see. There is something about darkness in a forest that people from cities often underestimate. In a city, darkness is rarely complete. There are streetlights, windows, headlights, signs, buildings. Even the night sky can glow above a city. In the forest, there may be almost nothing. Once the last sunlight disappears, the trees become silhouettes. Beyond a certain distance, the world simply vanishes. You can hear something without seeing it. You can know something is nearby without knowing exactly where it is. That evening, the camper ate dinner beside the fire. Nothing unusual happened. A few insects moved around the light. The wind occasionally became stronger. Somewhere in the distance, an animal made a strange sound. Then silence returned. The camper eventually extinguished the fire. Before going inside, they looked around the clearing one last time. There was nothing there. No person, no vehicle, no flashlight, no movement, only trees. Inside the RV, the door was locked. The curtains were closed. The lights were dimmed. The camper checked their phone. There was almost no signal. That was not unusual. The area was remote enough that the phone often showed only one bar, sometimes none. The camper placed it beside the bed and settled down. The refrigerator continued its quiet hum. The air conditioning unit occasionally clicked, and outside, the forest moved in the wind. For several hours, everything remained completely normal. The campers slept. The forest became colder. The wind changed direction. Clouds moved across the sky. The temperature dropped. And then, sometime after 3 in the morning, something happened. Something so ordinary that, at first, it did not seem frightening. There was a knock. 3 slow knocks. Knock. A pause. Knock. Another pause. Knock. Then silence. The camper opened their eyes. For several seconds, they did not move. They were still half asleep. The first thought was simple. Maybe it was a branch. Perhaps something had fallen against the RV. Maybe the wind had moved something outside. There were dozens of explanations. So the camper waited. Nothing happened. Then came another sound. A soft movement outside. Not a knock this time. Something scraping lightly against the side of the RV. The camper sat upright. The room was dark. The only light came from the faint glow of the charging phone. They looked toward the door. Nothing. The curtains were closed. The locks were still in place. For a moment, everything felt normal again. Then the knock came a second time. 3 knocks. Exactly the same rhythm. Knock. 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 The camper's heart began beating faster. Someone was outside. That was the first thought that could no longer be ignored. But another thought followed immediately. Who? There was no reason for anyone to be there. It was 3 in the morning. The nearest campground appeared empty. The road into the area was difficult to navigate even during daylight, and the camper had not seen another vehicle arrive. They reached for the phone. The screen illuminated the inside of the RV. No signal. They checked again. 1 bar. Then none. The camper waited for it to return. It didn't. Another knock. This time it was louder. Knock. 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 The sound seemed to come from the main door. The camper stayed completely still. They did not answer. They did not move toward the door. They simply listened. Then came a voice. A man's voice. Quiet. Almost calm. He said, "Excuse me?" The camper froze. For a few seconds, neither side spoke. Then the man outside said it again. "Excuse me?" His voice was not shouting. He did not sound angry. He sounded almost polite. And somehow, that made the situation more unsettling. The camper thought about asking who he was. But something stopped them. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the fact that they had never heard the man's voice before. Maybe it was simply the realization that there was no reasonable explanation for why someone would be standing outside an isolated RV at 3 in the morning. The voice came again. "Can you help me?" The camper looked toward the door. Still locked. Still closed. Still separating them from whoever was outside. Then the man said something that changed everything. He said, "I think I'm lost." It sounded harmless. A person lost in the woods. A person needing directions. A person who had perhaps taken the wrong trail. It happened. But the camper remembered something. There was only one road into the area, and the nearest public trail was several minutes away. Anyone who had somehow become lost would have had to walk through the forest in complete darkness to reach this campsite. The camper glanced toward the window. The curtains were still closed. They considered looking outside, but they stopped themselves. If the man really was lost, perhaps he could simply be directed toward the main road. If he was not, opening the curtain would reveal exactly where the camper was standing. The voice came again. "I just need to use a phone." The camper looked down at their own phone. No signal. They almost laughed. Almost. Because the request suddenly seemed strange. Why would a stranger assume an isolated camper had a working phone? And how had he found this specific RV? The camper finally spoke. "Where are you going?" Silence. No answer. The camper waited. Then the man outside said, "I need to get back to my car." That answer created another question. Where was his car? The camper asked him. The man did not respond immediately. Instead, there was a soft movement outside. A few footsteps. Then another sound. Something brushed against the side of the RV. The camper moved away from the door. The footsteps stopped. Silence returned. For almost a minute, nothing happened. Then the man knocked again. But this time, he did not knock 3 times. He knocked once, then twice, then once again. A different rhythm, almost as if he had become impatient. The camper did not answer. The man spoke. Are you awake? The question made the situation suddenly feel different. If he knew someone was inside, then he had already figured out that the RV was occupied. Of course, the vehicle itself suggested that, but hearing the words made it real. Someone was standing outside, and he knew there was a person inside. The camper remained silent. The man waited. Then he said, "I can see your light." The camper looked toward the small window. A faint glow from inside the RV was probably visible through the curtains. That meant the man was close enough to see it. Very close. The camper reached for the phone again. Still no signal. The screen showed the time. 3:07 a.m. Then something unexpected happened. The footsteps moved away from the door. One step, two, three, then several more. The sound traveled toward the back of the RV. The camper listened carefully. The footsteps stopped near the rear. Silence. Then, a gentle knock against the back wall. The camper's breathing became shallow. The person outside was walking around the RV. Another knock. This one was lower, almost at the level of the sleeping area. The camper slowly turned toward the rear window. The curtains remained closed. Nothing could be seen. Then the man spoke again, but his voice was different now. It was quieter, almost a whisper, and he said something that the camper would remember for a very long time. "You shouldn't be here alone." The words remained hanging in the darkness. The camper did not answer. The man did not knock again. For several seconds, there was absolute silence. Then the footsteps began moving away, slowly, toward the front of the RV, then beyond it, and finally, nothing. The camper waited. 30 seconds, a minute, 2 minutes, still nothing. The forest had returned to its normal sounds. Wind, trees, a distant animal. But the man was gone. At least, he seemed to be. The camper did not sleep again. They stayed awake until sunrise. They kept the lights off. They did not open the curtains. They did not unlock the door. And they did not hear another sound. When the first gray light of morning finally appeared through the curtains, the camper waited several more minutes. Then they looked outside. The campsite was empty. No person, no vehicle, no flashlight, no obvious sign that anyone had been there. But then they saw something beside the RV. Something that had not been there the evening before. A set of footprints. Fresh footprints. Leading from the forest. Toward the RV. And they stopped directly beside the door. The first thing the camper noticed was how clear they were. The ground around the RV was damp from the previous night's moisture, and the soft earth had preserved the shape of the soles remarkably well. One footprint, then another, then another. They came from the trees, straight toward the RV, and then they stopped. The camper stood inside the doorway for several seconds, staring at them. The door was still locked. Nothing appeared to have been disturbed, but the footprints made one thing impossible to ignore. Someone had been standing outside during the night. Very close, close enough to reach the door. The camper looked around the clearing. The morning light had changed everything. What had seemed enormous and frightening in the darkness now looked ordinary. Trees, bushes, the gravel road, the picnic table, the fire ring. Nothing moved. No person appeared between the trees. No vehicle was parked nearby. There was no obvious explanation for who had made the tracks. The camper stepped outside carefully. The first footprint was approximately 20 feet from the RV. Another appeared several feet closer. Then another. The person had walked directly toward the vehicle. There was no wandering pattern. No obvious hesitation. They had come straight to the RV. The tracks continued around the side. The camper followed them slowly. They went past the main door, around the rear, then disappeared where the ground became harder. The camper stopped. For a moment, the only sound was the wind. Then something caught their attention. There were footprints on the other side too. The person had walked around the entire RV. Not once, several times. The camper suddenly remembered the voice. "You shouldn't be here alone." The words sounded different in daylight. During the night, they had seemed threatening. Now they seemed almost like a warning. But a warning from whom? And why? The camper went back inside and locked the door again. They picked up the phone. Still almost no signal. They walked toward the front window. One bar. They tried making a call. Nothing. The call failed. They tried again. Nothing. The nearest ranger station was several miles away. The road out of the campsite was narrow. The camper considered leaving immediately. But before starting the RV, they wanted to understand what had happened. So they took photographs of the footprints. Several photographs. Close-ups. Wider images showing their position around the RV. Then they photographed the ground near the door. That was when they noticed something else. A small indentation in the soil, almost hidden beneath the edge of the RV. It looked like someone had stood there for a long time. Not simply walked past. Stood. Waiting. The camper looked at the door. Then at the indentation. Then back at the door. The realization was uncomfortable. The man might not have been looking for directions. He may have been watching the RV. The camper decided to leave. They started the engine. The sound echoed through the trees. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, somewhere deep in the forest, a bird suddenly flew from the branches. The camper watched it disappear. The road out was only a few miles long. But after the events of the night, every turn felt different. The trees seemed closer. The shadows seemed deeper. Every time the road disappeared behind a bend, the camper expected to see another person. Nobody appeared. Eventually, the RV reached the main road. There was a small ranger station, several miles farther. The camper drove there. When they arrived, a ranger was outside near a pickup truck. The camper explained what happened. The ranger listened carefully. He did not laugh. He did not dismiss the story. But he also did not immediately seem alarmed. The ranger asked several questions. What time did the knocking begin? What exactly did the man say? Did the camper see his face? How long did he remain outside? Did he touch the vehicle? Which direction did he leave? Was there another vehicle nearby? The camper answered as accurately as possible. 3 knocks. Then the voice. Then the request for a phone. Then the statement about being lost. Then the footsteps. Then the warning. And finally silence. The ranger asked to see the photographs. The camper showed him. The ranger looked at the footprints for several seconds. Then he zoomed in on one of the images. His expression changed slightly. "These aren't old," he said. The camper nodded. "I know." The ranger looked again. "Did you see anyone when you arrived yesterday?" "No." "Any other campers?" "Not nearby." "Any vehicles?" "No." The ranger looked toward the road. Then back at the photographs. He asked one more question. "Did he say his name?" The campers shook their head. "No." The ranger wrote something down. Then he said something that the camper had not expected. "There have been people reporting strange activity around these woods." The camper stared at him. "What kind of activity?" The ranger hesitated. "Mostly people hearing things." "Like what?" "Footsteps. Voices. Vehicles where there shouldn't be vehicles." The camper asked why they had never heard about this. The ranger shrugged. "Most people don't report it." That answer was not reassuring. The ranger explained that the area was larger than it appeared. There were old logging roads, abandoned trails, seasonal campsites. Some were not marked on modern maps. People occasionally wandered into the forest. Hunters, hikers, trespassers, teenagers, sometimes people who simply wanted to be alone. So a stranger appearing at an RV was not impossible. But there was one problem. The ranger looked again at the photograph of the footprints. The tracks don't look like someone who was lost. The camper asked why. The ranger pointed at the image. "Look at the direction." The footprints approached the RV directly, then continued around it. There was no reason for him to walk this way if he was trying to find the road. The camper felt cold despite the morning sun. The ranger continued. If he was lost, he'd probably follow the road. Instead, the footprints showed a person coming from the woods, directly toward the RV. The ranger asked if the camper had noticed anything missing. The camper thought about it. Everything appeared to be there. Wallet, phone, keys, food, camping equipment. Nothing seemed disturbed. Nothing appeared stolen. The ranger nodded. Then maybe he wasn't looking for anything. The camper asked what he meant. The ranger did not answer immediately. He simply looked toward the forest. After a few moments, he said, "Maybe he was looking for someone." The sentence stayed with the camper. Someone. Not something. Someone. The ranger offered to send another employee to inspect the campsite. The camper agreed. They drove back together. The ranger followed in his pickup. This time, the forest did not feel quite as frightening. There was another vehicle behind them. Another person. Daylight. A radio. Civilization was close. When they reached the campsite, the ranger walked around the RV. He examined the footprints himself. He took photographs. He crouched beside the door. Then he walked toward the trees. The camper followed at a distance. The footprints became harder to see after several yards. But the ranger kept looking. He eventually found another set. They were older, almost erased. They appeared to come from the opposite direction. From the road, toward the forest. The ranger stood silently. The camper asked what he was looking at. He said, "These aren't from last night." "How old?" "Can't say." He continued examining the ground. Then he found something else. A small piece of material caught on a branch. Dark fabric. It could have come from clothing, or it could have been something completely unrelated. The ranger photographed it, but did not touch it. The camper suddenly realized something. The man outside had never tried to force the door. He had never threatened them directly. He had simply knocked, asked for help, walked around the RV, and left. That should have made the situation less frightening. Instead, it made it more mysterious. If the man intended to hurt them, why hadn't he tried? If he wanted the phone, why didn't he leave when they refused? If he was genuinely lost, why had he walked around the RV? And why had he said, "You shouldn't be here alone"? The ranger did not have answers. He told the camper to stay somewhere else that night. The camper agreed. They packed their belongings. Before leaving, they looked toward the trees. For a brief moment, they thought they saw movement. Something between two trunks. A dark shape. They stared. Nothing. Maybe it had been a branch. Maybe an animal. Maybe nothing at all. The ranger asked if they saw something. The camper said no. They weren't sure. And perhaps that uncertainty was worse. Because now there was another possibility. Maybe the man had never really left. The camper drove away. The ranger remained behind. He walked around the campsite one final time. Then he noticed something near the rear of the RV. A second set of footprints. Much smaller. Not the same shoes. Not the same person. And they led in a completely different direction. Toward the old trail. The ranger followed them for several yards. Then stopped. Because beside the footprints was something else. A small object half buried beneath the leaves. Something that looked like a piece of plastic. He bent down, looked at it, and immediately called it in. Because the object appeared to have been there for a long time. And if it was what he thought it was, the strange visitor at the RV might not have been the first person to disappear into those woods. The ranger did not touch the object. He stood over it for several seconds, looking at the small piece of plastic half covered by leaves. From a distance, it could have been anything. A piece of packaging, part of a camping accessory, a fragment of some old equipment. The forest was full of discarded objects. But something about this one made him hesitate. He called another ranger. Then he stepped back. The second ranger arrived approximately 20 minutes later. By then, the morning sun had climbed higher, and the forest no longer looked threatening. But the object remained exactly where it had been found. They photographed it from several angles. Then they carefully moved the leaves surrounding it. That was when they realized it wasn't simply a random piece of plastic. It was part of a small identification card holder. Old, dirty, scratched, and apparently abandoned in the forest. There was no obvious name visible. The surface had been damaged, but one small portion remained readable. A number. Not enough to identify anyone immediately, but enough to make the rangers wonder whether the object belonged to someone who had once been in the area. The first ranger contacted local authorities. He explained the situation. A strange visitor had approached an RV during the night. Fresh footprints had been found around the vehicle, and now an old identification holder had been discovered near an unofficial trail. The connection might have been meaningless, but investigators had learned something over the years. In remote areas, seemingly unrelated details sometimes turn out to be connected. The object was collected. The rangers continued searching the surrounding area. They followed the older footprints for several yards. The trail eventually became almost impossible to distinguish from the natural ground. But then they found another clue. A cigarette, half buried in the dirt. It appeared old. There was no way to know who had left it. Still, it was photographed. Nothing was assumed. The investigation might have ended there if not for one small detail. The identification holder contained a partial number that matched an old missing person record. The record was more than a decade old. A person had disappeared from the region years earlier. The case had never received much attention. There had been no body, no confirmed sighting, no clear explanation, and the last known location was somewhere near these woods. The ranger read the information twice. Then he looked toward the trees. The missing person had been reported missing during the summer. They had been camping, alone. At least, that was what investigators believed. The case file was reopened, not because anyone believed the mysterious visitor was necessarily connected to the disappearance. There was no proof of that, but the possibility was too significant to ignore. The missing person was named Daniel Mercer. He was 34 years old when he disappeared. He had worked as a mechanic in a nearby town. He was described by friends as quiet, independent, someone who enjoyed hiking and camping alone. There had been no known enemies, no major financial problems, no obvious reason for him to vanish. On the day he disappeared, Daniel had told a co-worker that he planned to spend the weekend in the forest. He had packed basic camping equipment: food, water, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and an old camera. He never came home. His vehicle was eventually found near the entrance to the forest. The doors were locked. His wallet was inside. His phone was inside. His camping gear was missing. But Daniel was gone. At the time, investigators had searched the area. They found nothing significant. No body. No clear trail. No evidence of an accident. No obvious sign of violence. Eventually, the case went cold. Now, years later, the identification holder had appeared. The number was partially damaged, but investigators believed it could belong to Daniel. The timing was impossible to ignore. The ranger contacted the original investigator. That investigator had since retired, but he remembered the case. He remembered Daniel, and when he heard where the object had been found, he became interested. "Which trail?" he asked. The ranger gave him the location. There was silence. Then the retired investigator said, "That trail wasn't open when Daniel disappeared." The ranger looked at the map. The trail existed now, but apparently years earlier, it had been considered an unofficial route. That raised another question. How had Daniel known about it? Investigators began examining old maps. They discovered something interesting. The trail connected to an abandoned service road. The road had once been used by logging crews. It had been closed years before Daniel's disappearance, but parts of it were still accessible on foot, and the route eventually led deeper into the forest. The investigators decided to search it, not because they expected to find Daniel. After so many years, expectations were low, but because the identification holder had given them something they had never had before: a possible direction. The search began the following morning. Several investigators entered the woods. They marked their route. They photographed the ground. They examined old structures. They searched near the stream. They looked inside abandoned sheds. Nothing. Hours passed. Nothing. Then late in the afternoon, one investigator noticed something unusual. A tree had a small mark carved into its bark. 2 lines. Then a third. It looked deliberate, but it could have been anything. A hiker's mark. A hunter's mark. A random carving. There was no way to know. They continued. A few hundred yards farther, they found another mark. Same pattern. 3 lines. Then another. And another. The marks appeared to form a path. The investigators followed them. Eventually, they reached a clearing. There was almost nothing there. Just rocks, trees, and the remains of an old wooden structure. The structure had partially collapsed. Inside were fragments of rusted metal, broken glass, and old pieces of wood. One investigator noticed something beneath the structure. A small metal box. It was heavily corroded. They photographed it before moving it. When they opened it, there was almost nothing inside. A few pieces of paper had been destroyed by moisture. An old lighter, and a photograph. The photograph was badly damaged, but the image could still be seen. A campsite, a tent, and a man standing beside it. The investigators immediately stopped. They had no way of knowing whether the man was Daniel, but the photograph was clearly old, and the campsite looked familiar, very familiar. The photograph was sent for examination. The image was enhanced. The details became slightly clearer. The person in the photograph appeared to be Daniel Mercer, but investigators still needed confirmation. They contacted his family. Daniel's sister looked at the photograph. She recognized the jacket. She recognized the tent. And then she noticed something else. A small scar on the man's hand. She said Daniel had exactly the same scar. The photograph was now significant, but it raised a new question. Why had Daniel taken a photograph of that location? And why had it been hidden inside an old metal box? Investigators examined the image more closely. In the background, almost invisible between the trees, was another person. A second figure. Someone standing several yards behind Daniel. The image was too damaged to identify the person, but the figure was clearly there. The investigators enlarged the photograph. The figure appeared to be wearing dark clothing, a hood, or perhaps a jacket. The face was impossible to see, but the discovery changed the case. Daniel may not have been alone when the photograph was taken. That did not mean the second person had harmed him. They could have been another camper, a friend, a stranger, someone who happened to be walking through the background. There was no way to know, but suddenly, the old disappearance had a new possibility. Daniel had not necessarily vanished alone. Then investigators noticed something else. The photograph had a timestamp printed along the bottom. The date was visible. It matched the weekend Daniel disappeared. The forest became very quiet. For years, investigators had believed Daniel simply disappeared somewhere in the wilderness. Now they had evidence placing him at this exact location, and there was someone else in the frame. But the most disturbing discovery was still waiting. The investigators compared the photograph with the recent photographs taken around the RV campsite. The trees had changed. The forest had grown. The old structure had deteriorated. But the landscape itself was recognizable. Daniel had been in the same general area, the same forest, the same isolated trails, and possibly the same place where the unknown visitor had appeared decades later. The investigators returned to the RV campsite. They examined the footprints again. They examined the trail. Then they asked a question that nobody had considered before. What if the man at the RV was not looking for the camper? What if he had been looking for something else? Something hidden in the forest. Something connected to the old disappearance. That theory was only a possibility. There was no proof. But now there were too many strange connections to ignore. An old missing person. An abandoned trail. A photograph. An unidentified figure. A mysterious object. And a stranger appearing at an isolated RV at 3 in the morning. The investigation was becoming much larger than one frightening night. It had become a search through the past. And somewhere in those woods, investigators now suspected there might be something that someone had spent years trying to keep hidden. The photograph was small, only a few inches wide. Its edges had been damaged by moisture, and the surface was scratched in several places. The colors had faded until the trees in the background were almost the same shade as the ground. But one thing remained clear. Daniel Mercer was standing beside his campsite, and behind him, someone else was there. The investigators placed the photograph beneath a digital scanner. They adjusted the brightness, then the contrast. They tried to separate the figure from the trees. Slowly, details began to emerge. The person appeared to be standing approximately 30 feet behind Daniel. They were facing toward the camera, but their face was almost completely hidden. There was no obvious way to identify them. One investigator suggested that the person might simply be another camper. That was entirely possible. The forest attracted hikers and hunters. People occasionally crossed paths. Daniel may have taken the photograph without even noticing the stranger behind him. But another investigator noticed something unusual. The figure was not walking. They were standing still, and they appeared to be watching Daniel. That detail changed the feeling of the photograph. A random person walking through the background would make sense. Someone standing still and facing the campsite was different. Still, it was not proof of anything. The investigators reminded themselves of that. A photograph can create impressions that are not necessarily facts. So they continued looking. The original camera had never been recovered. Daniel's family remembered that he owned an older film camera. He used it during his camping trips. After his disappearance, the camera was never found. That meant the photograph had probably been developed before the disappearance. But who had taken it? Daniel? Or someone else? The investigators examined the photograph's perspective. The camera appeared to be positioned at approximately chest height. Daniel was facing it. His body posture looked relaxed. That suggested he knew the person holding the camera, or at least he was comfortable enough to pose. If Daniel had set up the camera himself using a timer, the photograph could make sense. He could have placed the camera on a rock, activated the timer, then walked into the frame. But if that was the case, why was the second person standing behind him? Perhaps the person had simply walked into the frame. Perhaps Daniel did not notice. Or perhaps the person was there intentionally. The investigators needed more information. They returned to Daniel's family. His sister provided several photographs from the years before his disappearance. They compared his clothing, his equipment, his camping habits. The tent in the old photograph matched one that Daniel had owned. So did the jacket. There was little doubt that the photograph was genuine. But then Daniel's sister noticed something investigators had missed. She pointed to the campsite. That isn't where he usually camped. The investigator looked at her. What do you mean? She explained that Daniel normally stayed near the main campground. He preferred locations closer to the road. He disliked being too far from other people. That made the photograph even stranger. Why had he gone so deep into the forest? Investigators examined his notes. Daniel had kept a small camping journal. Nothing dramatic. Dates, weather, places he visited. Sometimes a sentence or two about what he had seen. The final entry was short. It read, "Found an old road today. Someone has been using it." The investigators stopped. Someone had been using the abandoned road. That matched the location of the photograph. And it suggested Daniel had noticed human activity in an area that was supposedly unused. The next entry was dated 2 days later. But there was nothing written after it. The journal simply ended. The investigators returned to the forest. This time, they searched the old service road more carefully. They found tire marks in several places. Some were recent, others were old. The road had not been completely abandoned. Someone had been driving there occasionally. That raised another question. Who? The area was not officially open to ordinary vehicles. A ranger could use the road. Maintenance crews could use it. Occasionally, hunters might have found ways around the barriers. But Daniel had apparently noticed the activity. Investigators checked ranger records. No official vehicle had been recorded in that area during the weekend Daniel disappeared. That did not prove anything. Records could be incomplete, but it made the tire tracks more interesting. Then they found something beside the old road. A small metal object. At first, it looked like a broken piece of machinery. But after cleaning the dirt away, investigators realized it was part of a vehicle. An old mirror bracket. The metal was heavily rusted. It could have been there for years. They photographed it. Then they searched historical vehicle records for the area. Nothing immediately matched. The object was too generic. It could have come from dozens of vehicles. The clue led nowhere, at least for now. Meanwhile, the mystery of the second person in Daniel's photograph remained. Investigators enhanced the image again. This time, they noticed something around the figure's waist. A bright object. Perhaps a belt buckle. Perhaps a tool. Perhaps something else. The image was too poor to tell. One investigator suggested sending the photograph to a specialist in image restoration. The specialist worked on old damaged photographs. He could not create missing information, but he could sometimes recover details hidden by fading and scratches. The photograph was sent. Several days later, the investigators received the enhanced version. The figure was still impossible to identify, but the specialist had managed to reveal one detail. The person appeared to be wearing a light-colored glove on one hand. Only one hand was visible. The other was hidden. That detail might have meant nothing, but the investigators remembered something from the recent RV incident. The camper had described the stranger's voice. Not his hands. Not his face. Nothing about gloves. So there was no direct connection. Still, the investigators began wondering whether the person in Daniel's photograph had anything to do with the later visitor. The possibility was unsettling. Daniel disappeared years ago. The RV visitor appeared decades later. There was no obvious reason to connect them. Different people, different years, different circumstances, but both were associated with the same remote area. and both involved someone moving around an isolated campsite at night. Investigators did not publicly connect the two events. They did not want to create rumors. Instead, they kept the possibility inside the investigation. A theory, nothing more. Then another discovery changed things. The old identification holder found near the trail was examined more carefully. The partial number had initially been associated with Daniel, but it was not his full identification number. It was actually part of something else, a serial number. The number belonged to a piece of outdoor equipment. A manufacturer confirmed that the item had been sold years earlier. It was a model of portable radio. Investigators searched the original missing person file. Daniel had owned a portable radio. His family had reported it missing along with some of his camping equipment. But the radio had never been recovered. The serial number matched the model. Not necessarily the exact radio. The record was too incomplete. But it was enough to reopen an old question. Could the object in the forest have belonged to Daniel? The investigators searched the surrounding area again. This time, they found a small compartment hidden beneath the remains of the wooden structure. Inside was a corroded metal box, the same kind of box that had contained the photograph. But this one was empty, except for a small handwritten piece of paper. The paper was almost destroyed. Only a few words remained. The investigators carefully photographed it. Then they tried to reconstruct the writing. 3 words could be read clearly. Don't follow him. Nobody knew who had written them. Nobody knew who him referred to. And nobody knew when the message had been placed there. It could have been written by Daniel. It could have been written by someone else. It could even have nothing to do with the disappearance. But the location made it impossible to ignore. The investigators now had several pieces of information. Daniel had discovered an abandoned road. He believed someone was using it. He took a photograph in the area. Another person appeared behind him. He disappeared shortly afterward. Years later, evidence connected to his belongings was found near the same trail. And decades later, a stranger appeared outside an RV in the same general region. The puzzle was beginning to look different. But it was still a puzzle. There was no proof that Daniel had been murdered. No proof that the mysterious stranger was connected to him. No proof that the note belonged to Daniel. And no proof that the old object had been intentionally hidden. The investigators therefore did something important. They separated the facts from the theories. Fact, Daniel disappeared. Fact, his photograph was found. Fact, another person appeared in the photograph. Fact, Daniel had written about an old road. Fact, evidence associated with the area was discovered years later. Fact, a stranger approached an RV decades afterward. Everything else remained a possibility. That night, one investigator returned home with the photograph. He placed it on his desk. He looked at Daniel, then at the figure behind him, and he noticed something he had not noticed before. The second person was standing beside a tree, and carved into that tree were 3 lines, the same 3 lines investigators had found marking the trail. The investigators stared at the photograph. If the marks were the same, it meant something important. The person in the photograph had been standing beside the trail, not randomly, not somewhere else, right beside the route that investigators had followed years later. And if Daniel had taken the photograph there, then the strange figure may have known exactly where he was. The question was no longer simply, who was the man in the photograph? It was, what did he want Daniel to see? And perhaps even more importantly, why had someone returned to the same forest decades later? The 3 marks on the tree were small, so small that someone walking past them in daylight might never notice. 3 short lines carved into the bark, nothing more. But now investigators knew those same markings appeared farther along the trail. And apparently, they had existed when Daniel Mercer was still alive. That changed the significance of the entire trail. The investigators returned to the forest early the next morning. They brought photographs of the marks. They brought the old photograph of Daniel. And they brought the note that read, "Don't follow him." They wanted to determine whether all 3 pieces belonged to the same story. The first marked tree stood near the old service road. The second was approximately 200 yards away. The third was farther still. Each mark looked similar. 3 lines. The same approximate size. The same direction. But similarity was not enough. Nature could produce patterns. People could make similar marks independently. Someone could have copied an existing symbol. So investigators carefully photographed every mark. They then searched old photographs from the original investigation. The problem was that the 2000s investigation had not documented every part of the forest. At the time Daniel disappeared, investigators had focused primarily on the areas they believed he might have visited. The abandoned service road had received less attention. The trail had not been considered important. No one had known about the marks. No one had known about the photograph. And no one had known about the note. That was one of the difficulties of cold cases. Investigators do not simply work with evidence. They work with the assumptions of previous investigations. If something was not considered important at the time, it may never have been photographed. If an area was not searched carefully, evidence may remain there for years. And if nobody knows what to look for, they can walk past the answer without recognizing it. The team followed the old service road deeper into the forest. The road became narrower. Eventually, it was little more than 2 strips of dirt surrounded by grass. Trees had grown across parts of it. Branches covered sections. But tire marks could still be seen in places. One investigator stopped. There were fresh marks. Not decades old. Fresh. The soil had been disturbed recently. A vehicle had passed through. The investigators measured the width of the tracks. They photographed them. Then they looked toward the trees. The road was not supposed to be used by ordinary visitors. So who had driven here? They contacted the forestry department. The department checked its records. No maintenance vehicle had used the road recently. No authorized work was scheduled. The road was officially closed. The investigators returned to the tracks. If an unauthorized vehicle had entered the area, there might be more evidence. They followed the tracks. For nearly half a mile, they remained visible. Then the road split. One direction continued toward an old maintenance building. The other disappeared into thicker forest. The vehicle had taken the second route. The investigators followed. The forest became darker. Even during the day, the trees blocked much of the sunlight. The ground was uneven. Roots pushed through the soil. Leaves covered the trail. Then they found something. A tire track that suddenly stopped. Not because the road ended, because the vehicle had turned sharply. The investigators examined the ground. There were footprints nearby. Fresh. Someone had recently gotten out of the vehicle. The tracks led toward the trees. And beside them, 3 lines were carved into another tree. The investigators stood silently. The marks were becoming difficult to dismiss. Someone had been using this route. Someone knew about the markings. And someone had been here recently. They followed the footprints. After approximately 100 yards, they reached a small clearing. There was an old concrete foundation. Nothing remained of the building except part of the floor and a few walls. The structure had probably been used decades earlier. Perhaps a storage shed. Perhaps a maintenance shelter. There was no sign indicating what it had been. Inside the ruins, investigators found cigarette wrappers, a plastic bottle, a food container, all relatively recent. Someone had been spending time there. Not decades ago. Recently. Then one investigator noticed a small metal hook attached to the wall. Something had been hanging from it. The metal was clean compared with the surrounding rust. Whatever had been there had been removed recently. They searched the floor. Nothing. Then the investigator noticed a small gap beneath a broken piece of concrete. He moved it carefully. Underneath was a black fabric bag. It was dusty, but not old. The bag contained almost nothing. A flashlight, a pair of gloves, a small folding knife, and several photographs. The investigators examined the photographs. The first showed the forest. The second showed the old road. The third showed the campsite. The fourth showed an RV. The investigators froze. The RV was the same type of vehicle involved in the recent incident. Not necessarily the same RV, but similar. The photograph appeared to have been taken from a distance. Someone had been watching a campsite. The next photograph showed another campsite, then another, then another. Different locations, different vehicles, different years. It appeared someone had been documenting campers. The investigators carefully arranged the photographs. There were 12. Some were old. Some appeared recent. The dates were unclear, but the pattern was disturbing. The final photograph was different. It showed a man, standing beside a forest trail. His face was partially turned away. He was wearing dark clothing. and one hand had a light-colored glove. The same detail seen in Daniel's photograph. The investigators compared the images. They could not confirm that the person was the same individual. The photographs were too poor. The faces were obscured, but the clothing style was similar. The glove was similar, and the location was the same forest. Then they found a handwritten note inside the bag. Only one sentence. He comes when someone camps alone. The investigators immediately thought about the RV visitor. A stranger had appeared at 3 in the morning. The camper had been alone. The stranger had specifically said, "You shouldn't be here alone." The coincidence was becoming difficult to ignore, but there was still no direct proof. The bag could have belonged to someone unrelated. The photographs could have been taken by a harmless photographer. The note could have been written by anyone. The glove could have been coincidence. Investigators knew better than to build a case entirely on coincidence. They needed something stronger. They needed identification. The photographs were sent for forensic examination. Experts tried to determine when they had been taken. Some contained enough information to establish approximate dates. The newest photograph appeared to have been taken only months earlier. The oldest appeared to be several years old, but none could be reliably dated to Daniel's disappearance. Then they examined the photograph of Daniel again. The figure in the background, the dark clothing, the glove, the tree, the 3 markings. Everything seemed connected, but there was one major problem. The person in Daniel's photograph appeared to be younger. If the same person was now visiting campsites decades later, they would have aged significantly. The investigators couldn't tell. The photograph was too poor. They returned to the question of Daniel. Why had he gone to the old service road? Why had he written that someone was using it? Why had he taken the photograph? And why had he disappeared? They searched his financial records. There were no unusual transactions. They searched his phone records. Nothing suspicious. They interviewed people who knew him. No one knew about an enemy. No one knew about a secret relationship. No one knew why he might have been meeting someone in the forest. Then they found one small detail. A co-worker remembered Daniel mentioning a person, a man he had seen near the forest. Daniel had described him only once. The co-worker remembered the words. "He doesn't look like a camper." That sentence became important. The co-worker could not remember exactly what the man looked like, but Daniel had apparently been concerned enough to mention him. The investigator asked why Daniel had not reported him. The co-worker shrugged. He probably didn't think it was serious. That was understandable. Seeing a stranger in the woods is not automatically suspicious. People hike. People camp. People work in forests. People pass through. But Daniel had also written, "Someone has been using it." And later, "Don't follow him." The investigators now believed those notes might have been connected. Daniel may have been observing someone. Someone may have realized Daniel was observing them, and Daniel may have become frightened. But if that was true, why had Daniel taken the photograph? Perhaps he wanted evidence. Perhaps he wanted to show someone what he had seen. Perhaps he planned to report it. Or perhaps the photograph was simply taken before he understood the danger. The investigators returned to the old photograph. They enlarged the figure. This time, they focused on the man's hand. The glove was visible, but beneath the glove was something else. A ring. A dark ring around one finger. The investigators contacted Daniel's family. They asked whether Daniel had known anyone who wore a distinctive ring. His sister thought for several seconds. Then she remembered someone. A man Daniel had briefly worked with years earlier. Someone who had disappeared from the area shortly before Daniel himself vanished. The investigators searched the name. The man was no longer in the local records. He had moved away, but according to one old address record, he had once lived less than 20 miles from the forest. And according to another record, he had worked in forestry. The investigation suddenly had its first possible person of interest. Not a suspect. Not yet. Just a name. A man who had known the area. A man who may have known Daniel. A man who had disappeared from local records around the same time. The investigators searched for him. They found an old photograph, and when they compared it with the figure in Daniel's photograph, the face still could not be confirmed. But the ring was visible. A dark ring on the same finger. For the first time, the mystery had a potential identity. But before investigators could determine where that man had gone, they discovered something even more disturbing. The man's name appeared in another file. A missing person report from the same forest. And this time, the disappearance had happened only 3 years earlier. The name appeared in the file almost by accident. A man who had once lived near the forest. A man who had apparently known the area well. A man whose connection to Daniel Mercer was still uncertain. And now investigators had discovered something else. He had disappeared. Not decades ago. Not during Daniel's disappearance. Only 3 years earlier. The investigators obtained the missing person report. The man's name was Michael Rowan. He was 46 years old when he disappeared. He had lived alone. He worked irregular jobs involving construction, forestry, and seasonal maintenance. People who knew him described him as private. He rarely talked about his personal life. He spent considerable time outdoors. And according to one former co-worker, he knew the old forest roads better than almost anyone. Michael had been reported missing after failing to return home from a weekend trip. His vehicle was discovered near the same forest. The doors were locked. There was no obvious damage. Inside were several personal belongings. A jacket, a water bottle, a flashlight, and a map of the forest. There was no body, no confirmed sighting, no clear explanation. The search lasted several days. Teams entered the forest. Dogs were brought in. Helicopters searched from above. Nothing was found. Eventually, the case became inactive. The investigators reading the report looked at each other. 2 people, 2 disappearances, same forest, different decades, and now a possible connection between them. But the timeline was strange. Daniel disappeared many years before Michael. If Michael had known Daniel, he would have had to be involved in the area for a very long time. That was possible, but there was no proof. Investigators searched old employment records. Michael had indeed worked in forestry. One of his former employers had operated in the region around the time Daniel disappeared. That did not establish a connection, but it gave investigators another reason to look deeper. They interviewed Michael's former co-workers. Most remembered him as quiet. One man remembered something unusual. Michael had been fascinated by abandoned roads. He often explored places that other workers avoided. When asked why, he supposedly said, "There are places out there nobody knows about." That statement might have been harmless. But another co-worker remembered something else. Michael had once mentioned a man named Daniel. The investigator asked him to repeat the name. He did. Daniel Mercer. The room went quiet. This was the first independent connection between the 2 men. Michael had apparently known Daniel. But how? The co-worker explained that Michael had mentioned Daniel only a few times. He never described their relationship. He simply said Daniel had been asking questions. The investigator asked what kind of questions. The co-worker couldn't remember, but he remembered Michael becoming uncomfortable whenever Daniel's name came up. Investigators searched Daniel's records again. They found no formal complaint against Michael. No police report. No documented dispute. Nothing. Then they found an old photograph. A workplace photograph taken before Daniel disappeared. Several employees were standing together. One of them was Michael, and several people away was Daniel. They were not close. They were simply in the same group. But it confirmed they had known each other. Investigators began reconstructing their timelines. Daniel visited the forest. He wrote that someone was using the abandoned road. He disappeared. Years later, Michael remained in the area. Then, years after that, Michael disappeared himself. The obvious question was, what happened to Michael? Investigators returned to the location where his vehicle had been found. The vehicle had been parked near the main forest road, but the old search had focused primarily on the area around the vehicle. Investigators now wondered whether Michael had intentionally walked toward the abandoned service road. They checked his map. There was a handwritten mark. 3 lines. The same symbol. The investigators stared at the map. 3 lines had been drawn beside an old trail. The same pattern appeared on the trees. The same pattern appeared near the place where Daniel's photograph had been taken, and now it appeared on Michael's map. This was becoming much more difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Investigators searched Michael's home. He had left behind boxes of photographs. Most showed forests, trails, old buildings, abandoned roads. Nothing unusual at first. Then they found a folder. Inside were photographs of Daniel's former campsite. The investigators could not immediately determine when the photographs had been taken, but some were clearly recent compared with the original investigation. Michael had apparently returned to the area many years after Daniel disappeared. Why? One photograph showed the old wooden structure where the metal box had been found. Another showed the trail. Another showed the three-line marking. And one showed something investigators had never seen before. A photograph of Daniel's old campsite. Someone had been studying the location. The investigators began to wonder whether Michael had been searching for something. Perhaps something Daniel had left behind. Perhaps evidence. Perhaps an object. Perhaps a secret. But there was another possibility. Maybe Michael had been investigating Daniel's disappearance himself. Perhaps he knew something. Perhaps he felt responsible. Perhaps he was searching for an answer. There was no way to know. Michael was missing. He could not explain the photographs. He could not explain the markings. And he could not explain his connection to Daniel. Then investigators found a handwritten note inside Michael's home. It contained only one sentence. He never left the forest. Nobody knew what the sentence meant. Did he refer to Daniel? Was Michael saying Daniel had died in the forest? Was he referring to someone else? Or was it simply part of a private note unrelated to the case? Investigators examined the handwriting. It appeared consistent with Michael's writing. But that did not answer the question. Then they discovered another note. This one was dated several weeks before Michael disappeared. It said, "Someone is still watching the camps." The investigators immediately thought about the photographs found near the old structure. Someone had been photographing campers. Someone had been visiting the forest. Someone had been watching. And then there was the RV incident. A stranger at 3 in the morning. The words, "You shouldn't be here alone." The footprints. The photographs. The old notes. The three-line markings. Daniel's disappearance. Michael's disappearance. The case was no longer just about a mysterious person outside an RV. It was beginning to look like a pattern, but investigators still needed to be extremely careful. A pattern can be real, or it can be created by connecting unrelated events. They decided to test one thing: the visitor's footprints. The camper had photographed them. Investigators compared the tread pattern with footwear found among Michael's belongings. Michael had owned several pairs of boots. One pair had a distinctive sole. The pattern looked similar, very similar, but the boots were old, and the photographs of the footprints were not detailed enough to establish a definitive match. Still, investigators kept the possibility open. Could Michael have been the person outside the RV? If so, why? His disappearance had occurred 3 years earlier. If he was dead, someone else had to be involved. If he was alive, where had he gone? They searched his known addresses. Nothing. They checked financial activity. Almost nothing after his disappearance. They checked known relatives. No contact. They checked employment. No confirmed records. Michael had seemingly vanished. Just like Daniel. Then an investigator noticed something in the photograph found in the forest. The figure behind Daniel. The investigator compared the figure's clothing with the photographs of Michael from years earlier. The height seemed similar. The build seemed similar. The ring appeared similar, but the face remained impossible to identify. They needed another image. Something clearer. Something taken around the same time as Daniel's disappearance. They searched old workplace photographs. Eventually they found one. Michael was standing near a vehicle. His right hand was visible. On one finger was a dark ring. The investigator enlarged the image. The ring had a distinctive shape. A small dark stone. A narrow metal band. Then they returned to Daniel's photograph. The object on the figure's hand appeared similar, but similarity was still not proof. The investigators needed more, and they found it in an unexpected place. Michael's old vehicle records. One vehicle registered to him had been sold shortly before Daniel disappeared. The buyer's address was only a few miles from the forest. Investigators located the buyer. The man remembered Michael. He remembered the vehicle. And he remembered something else. Michael had left an old box inside the vehicle when he sold it. The buyer had thrown it away years earlier. But before doing so, he had removed one object. A small key. The buyer still had it. Investigators examined the key. It did not match Michael's home. It did not match his vehicle. It did not match any known property. Then they tested it against an old lock found inside the abandoned forest structure. It fit. For the first time, investigators had something tangible. A key, a hidden structure, a man who knew the forest, a missing person, and a connection to Daniel. But the key opened only one small metal cabinet. Inside was a collection of old documents, and at the very bottom, a photograph. The photograph showed the forest. A young Daniel stood in the foreground. Behind him stood Michael, and beside Michael was another man, a man investigators had never seen before. The photograph had been taken shortly before Daniel disappeared, and on the back, written in faded handwriting, were 6 words. If anything happens, find him. The photograph changed the investigation. Until that moment, investigators had been working with possibilities. Daniel knew Michael. Michael knew the forest. Michael had photographs connected to Daniel. Michael had disappeared, and someone had apparently been watching the campsites. But now there was another person, a third man, someone standing beside Michael in the photograph. Someone Daniel had apparently known, and someone whose identity investigators could not immediately determine. The photograph was placed under examination. The image was old, but the faces were clear enough to study. Daniel stood on one side. Michael stood beside him. The third man stood slightly behind them. Unlike the mysterious figure in the original photograph, this man's face was visible. Investigators enlarged it. Then they searched databases. Nothing. No immediate match. They contacted Daniel's family again. His sister studied the photograph for several minutes. Then she said something unexpected. "I've seen him before." The investigator asked where. She couldn't remember his name, but she remembered seeing him with Daniel. Not often, only once or twice. She described him as someone Daniel had met through work. That gave investigators a new direction. They returned to Daniel's former workplace. Several retired employees were interviewed. One of them recognized the man immediately. His name was Thomas Hale. Thomas had worked around the same area as Daniel and Michael. He was involved in equipment maintenance. He had occasionally worked near the forest, and according to former co-workers, he knew the old service roads extremely well. But Thomas had not been mentioned in the original investigation. Why? Because he had left the area before Daniel disappeared. He had moved to another state. At the time, investigators had found no reason to consider him relevant. The new investigators searched for him. They found an address, then another, then another. Thomas had moved several times over the years. He had changed jobs. He had lived in different towns. But eventually, investigators found a current record. He was alive, and he was living several hundred miles away. That discovery changed the situation. If Thomas was alive, investigators could question him. They contacted him. He agreed to speak. The interview began calmly. Thomas remembered Daniel. He remembered Michael. He remembered the forest. He even remembered the old service road. But when investigators showed him the photograph, his expression changed. Only slightly. But they noticed. They asked him if he recognized the location. He said yes. They asked whether he had been there with Daniel. He said he couldn't remember. They showed him the photograph again. Thomas stared at it, then said, "I don't remember that day." The investigators asked why. Thomas said it had been too long. He had worked with many people. He had spent years in the forest. He could not remember every trip. That explanation was reasonable. But the investigators continued. They asked about Michael. Thomas said Michael had been difficult. He described him as secretive, always asking questions, always exploring places he shouldn't. Then investigators asked, "What kind of questions?" Thomas paused. "About the old road, the same road." Again, Thomas explained that Michael believed people were using the abandoned road illegally. He had apparently seen vehicles there. He thought someone was hiding something. Thomas said he told Michael to leave it alone. Why? Thomas looked at the investigator, then answered, "Because some things aren't worth finding." The investigator asked what he meant. Thomas refused to elaborate. They asked whether he had ever threatened Michael. "No." "Did you argue?" "Sometimes." "Did you know Daniel?" "Yes." "Did Daniel know about the road?" Thomas said, "Probably." That word mattered. Probably. It suggested Daniel had known more than Thomas wanted to say. The investigators asked about the three-line markings. Thomas said he had seen them. They asked what they meant. He said, "I don't know." Then he changed his answer. "I used to think they were trail markers." The investigators noticed the change. "Used to?" Thomas said nothing. They asked about the photograph. The photograph showing Daniel, Michael, and Thomas. Thomas finally admitted he remembered the day. He had forgotten at first. Then, after seeing the photograph, memories came back. He said the three men had been in the forest because Michael wanted to show them something. Something near the old service road. What? Thomas refused to say. The investigator asked again. Thomas remained silent. Finally, he said, Michael believed someone was using the forest to hide things. What things? Equipment. Illegal equipment? I don't know. Then what? Thomas looked away. Something worse. The interview became more serious. Investigators asked what he meant by worse. Thomas said Michael believed someone had been using abandoned buildings in the forest. Not for camping. Not for hunting. For something else. What? Thomas did not answer. The investigators showed him the photograph of the man behind Daniel. Thomas looked at it. Then he said, I don't know who that is. The investigator asked, Are you sure? Thomas replied, Yes. But there was something strange. Thomas had previously said he could not remember the day. Now he was certain he did not know the person in the photograph. That contradiction made investigators suspicious. They asked about the ring. Thomas wore no ring during the interview. They showed him the photograph of the unidentified figure. Then they showed him the old photograph of Thomas. The rings looked different, so that line of suspicion weakened. But investigators were still interested in Thomas, because he had admitted something important. Michael believed someone was using the forest. Daniel had written that someone was using the old road, and both men disappeared. Thomas was asked whether he believed Michael had been murdered. He remained silent for several seconds, then said, I don't know. Do you believe Daniel was murdered? Another pause. I don't know. Do you believe both disappearances are connected? Thomas looked directly at the investigator and said, They are. The room became silent. The investigator asked, How? Thomas refused to answer. Eventually he said, You're looking at the wrong person. The investigator asked what he meant. Thomas said, You're looking for someone who was there. Who? Not who. He paused. Why? That answer frustrated investigators. They needed facts, names, locations, evidence, not riddles. Before the interview ended, Thomas gave them one final piece of information. He said there was another structure deeper in the forest, an old maintenance bunker, almost completely hidden. He said Michael had discovered it, and he believed Daniel had been there. Investigators asked why he had never mentioned it before. Thomas said, Because I didn't think anyone would find it. The location was added to the map. Investigators planned to search it the next morning. But Thomas gave them a warning. Don't go after dark. They asked why. Thomas simply replied, Because that's when he comes. The interview ended. Thomas left. Investigators remained behind. They reviewed everything he had said. Some statements were useful. Others were vague. But one thing was clear. Thomas knew much more about the forest than he had initially admitted. The next morning, investigators returned to the woods. They followed an old route Thomas had described. The trail was difficult. Branches blocked the way. The ground became steep. Eventually, they found the bunker. It was almost invisible from the main trail. A concrete structure built into the hillside. The entrance was covered by vegetation. The door was locked. Investigators searched around it. Then they found a small metal box attached to the wall. Inside was a key. The key opened the bunker. The door moved slowly. A smell of damp earth came from inside. The investigators entered. Their flashlights moved across the walls. There were shelves, old equipment, empty containers, and a table. On the table were several photographs. The investigators picked up the first one. It showed Daniel. The second showed Michael. The third showed Thomas. Then came another photograph. This one showed the RV campsite, but the photograph was not recent. It had been taken years earlier. Someone had photographed that exact clearing long before the camper arrived. The investigators searched the table. There were maps, dates, coordinates, and handwritten notes. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Wait until they are alone. The investigators stared at the words. The case had just changed again, because now there was evidence suggesting that someone had been deliberately watching isolated campers. And if the photographs were genuine, the person responsible had been doing it for years. Then one investigator opened the final folder. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Daniel standing beside the forest trail. Behind him was the same unidentified figure. But this time, the person's face was visible, and on the back of the photograph was a date. The date was the day before Daniel disappeared. The photograph was placed on the table. For several seconds, nobody spoke. The investigators had seen the image of Daniel before. They had seen the damaged photograph found in the forest. They had seen the figure standing behind him. But this photograph was different. The face of the second person was clearer. Not perfectly clear, but clear enough to give investigators something they had never had before. A face. The photograph showed Daniel standing beside the old trail. He appeared relaxed. There was no obvious sign that he was frightened. Behind him stood the unidentified man. The man's face was turned slightly toward the camera. His expression was difficult to read. He appeared to be looking directly at Daniel. The investigator enlarged the image. The man's features became more visible. Dark hair, medium build, a narrow face, and something else. A small mark near the left side of his jaw. The investigators immediately compared the photograph with available records. Nothing matched. No obvious identity. No criminal record. No missing person record. No employment record. Nothing. They then compared the image with Thomas Hale. It wasn't Thomas. The investigators were certain. The face was different. The height seemed different. The build was different. Thomas had been telling the truth about one thing. He did not appear to be the man in the photograph. But then another possibility emerged. Perhaps Thomas knew who the man was. Investigators returned to the interview. They showed Thomas the clearer photograph. His reaction was immediate. He became silent. For several seconds, he simply stared at the image. Then he said, "I've seen him." The investigator leaned forward. "Where?" Thomas did not answer. "Who is he?" Thomas looked at the photograph again. Then he said, "I don't know his name." That answer was not enough. But it was the first admission that Thomas recognized the man. Thomas explained that he had seen the man near the old service road. Several times. Usually at night. He said the man rarely spoke. He seemed to know the forest extremely well. He appeared to move around without using the main roads. And according to Thomas, he was always alone. The investigators asked why Thomas had never reported him. Thomas said he didn't believe the man was doing anything illegal. Until Daniel disappeared. After Daniel disappeared, Thomas said, "I stopped going there." The investigator asked why. Thomas answered, "Because I realized Daniel had been right. The man had been using the forest." But for what? Thomas didn't know. He had seen him carrying bags. Sometimes equipment. Sometimes nothing. He had seen vehicles near the old road. But he had never seen exactly what happened inside the buildings. The investigators asked whether Daniel had confronted the man. Thomas said, "I think so. That was important. Daniel may have discovered something. He may have followed the man. He may have confronted him. And perhaps that confrontation had led to his disappearance." But Thomas still insisted he did not know what the man was doing. Then investigators asked the obvious question, "What happened to Michael?" Thomas looked down. He said, "He found out." The investigators asked, "Found out what?" Thomas did not answer. They pressed him. Michael had disappeared 3 years earlier. Was it connected to the same man? Thomas finally nodded. "I think so." That was the strongest statement Thomas had given. But investigators still needed evidence. They asked where Michael had gone. Thomas said he didn't know. Then he added, "But he was looking for the bunker." The bunker. The same structure investigators had just entered. The same place where the photographs had been found. The same place where someone had apparently monitored campsites. Investigators returned to the bunker. They searched every shelf, every drawer, every box. They looked beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, inside the old equipment. Eventually, one investigator found something hidden beneath the table. A small metal container. It was locked. The key was found nearby. Inside the container was a notebook. The pages were old. Some were damaged, but the writing was legible. The first pages contained dates, locations, vehicle descriptions, names. Some were unfamiliar. Others were connected to campers who had visited the forest. It appeared someone had been documenting people, not randomly, systematically. The investigators turned the pages. One entry mentioned Daniel. Another mentioned Michael. Then came an entry that made everyone stop. It contained the description of an RV. The date was recent, only weeks before the 3 o'clock morning incident. The investigator read the entry again. It described an RV parked alone near the forest. The description matched the camper's vehicle. This was no longer coincidence. Someone had been watching that RV before the night of the knocking. The next page contained a sentence. Wait until 3. The investigators stared at the page. 3. The exact time the stranger had appeared. Then they found another entry. Knock first. The room became silent. The notebook appeared to describe the incident before it happened. But who had written it? And how had it been written? The handwriting was examined. It did not appear to match Daniel. It did not match Michael. It did not match Thomas. The investigators sent it for forensic analysis. Then they found something even more disturbing. The notebook contained dozens of similar entries. Different campsites, different dates, different descriptions, and nearly every entry involved someone camping alone. Some entries ended with left, others, no contact, and some simply said, followed. The investigators began realizing that the RV incident might not have been an isolated event. The visitor may have approached other campers before, maybe many times, but there was no evidence of murder in those cases. No missing people directly linked to the notebook. No confirmed attacks. Just observations. Watching. Following. Waiting. Then they found a name. One entry contained a full name. Daniel Mercer. Beside it was a date. The day before his disappearance. And underneath his name were 3 words. He saw me. The investigators read it several times. Daniel had seen the man. The man knew Daniel had seen him. And the following day, Daniel disappeared. The next entry was dated 3 years later. It contained another name, Michael Rowan. Beside it, he knows. Michael disappeared. Then came the most recent entry, the RV camper's description. And beneath it, he is alone. The investigators now had a potential pattern spanning decades. Daniel, Michael, the recent camper, all connected to the same forest. All connected to someone who watched isolated people. But there was still one enormous question. Who was writing the notebook? The handwriting expert returned an initial assessment. The writing appeared to have been produced by one person. But the notebook contained entries written over many years. The writer had maintained the same style, the same letter formation, the same unusual way of writing certain numbers. The investigators asked whether the writer could be identified from handwriting alone. The answer was no, not reliably, but the sample could be compared with known individuals. They compared it with Thomas. No match. Daniel. No match. Michael. No match. Then investigators remembered the mysterious man in the photograph. The man whose face they had finally recovered. They needed a name. They circulated the photograph internally. A detective who had worked in the region years earlier saw it. He stared at the photograph, then said something that changed everything. I know that face. The others looked at him. He explained that the man had appeared in an old investigation. Not as a suspect, not as a victim, as a witness. The man's name was Elias Ward. He had lived near the forest years earlier. He had worked temporary jobs. He had occasionally assisted with maintenance projects. And he had been questioned during Daniel's disappearance. But investigators had never considered him important. Why? Because Elias had claimed he had never been near the forest that weekend. And at the time, investigators had no evidence contradicting him. Now they had a photograph, a notebook, and a possible connection to Daniel. The investigators searched for Elias. His old address was abandoned. His phone number no longer worked. His employment records ended years earlier. There was no obvious current address. It appeared Elias had disappeared from ordinary records. Then one investigator found something. A vehicle registration. An old truck. The registration had been renewed under a different name, but the vehicle itself appeared to be the same, and the last known location was less than 20 miles from the forest. The investigators now had a person, a face, a possible motive, a notebook, and decades of unexplained disappearances. But there was still no proof that Elias was responsible for Daniel or Michael. They needed to find him. That night, the investigation team returned to the forest. They searched the old road. They searched the bunker. They searched the trails. And eventually, near the edge of the woods, they found fresh tire tracks. A vehicle had recently entered the forest. The tracks matched the approximate width of Elias's old truck. The investigators followed them. The tracks led deeper into the trees, then stopped beside an abandoned cabin. The cabin appeared empty. The door was slightly open. Inside, there was a chair, a table, a lantern, and on the table, a fresh cup of coffee, still warm. The cup of coffee was still warm. That was the first thing the investigators noticed. The second was the smell. Fresh coffee, not hours old, not something left there yesterday. Someone had been inside the cabin recently, very recently. The investigators stopped at the doorway. Nobody moved. The cabin was silent. A small wooden structure hidden deep in the forest. One table, two chairs, a narrow bed, an old stove, and almost nothing else. But the coffee on the table changed everything. Someone had been there, and whoever it was had left only moments before. One investigator stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath his boots. He looked toward the back of the cabin. Nothing. The other investigator checked the windows. One was open slightly. Cold air entered through the gap. Check outside. Two investigators moved around the cabin. Fresh footprints were visible in the damp soil. They led away from the door, toward the trees. The person had left on foot. The investigators followed the tracks. They moved quickly. Whoever had made them was not trying to hide them, at least not completely. The footprints continued for several hundred yards. Then suddenly, they disappeared. There was no road, no stream, no rocky ground, nothing that should have erased them. The trail simply stopped. The investigators searched the surrounding area. One found a broken branch. Another found a small piece of dark fabric. Then they noticed something else, a narrow opening between two large rocks. Behind it was a small passage. The passage led downhill. It was barely wide enough for one person. At the bottom was another clearing, and in the clearing stood an old vehicle, covered with a dark tarp. The investigators approached carefully. The vehicle was an old pickup truck. Rust covered the sides. The license plate was missing, but the shape matched the truck connected to Elias Ward. They removed the tarp. The driver's door was unlocked. Inside was dust, old maps, an empty water bottle, a flashlight, and a set of keys. One key was different. It was new, clean. The investigators photographed it. Then they searched the truck. Under the driver's seat, they found a small notebook. The first pages contained dates, the same style of writing, the same strange numbers, the same handwriting that had appeared in the bunker. The notebook belonged to Elias. At least, investigators now believed it did. They turned the pages. Most entries were brief. Locations, times, descriptions. Then they found one that mentioned the cabin. Cabin remains safe. Another, bunker compromised. And another. They found the old road. The investigators looked at each other. Someone had known they were coming. Then they found a more recent entry. Only 2 days old. RV still there. The investigators froze. The RV. The camper. The same person who had been watched. The same person who had been approached. The next line was even more disturbing. Tonight, the investigators immediately contacted the camper. But the camper was already safe. They had left the forest. That meant Elias had been watching the location, and he had apparently planned to return. The investigators continued through the notebook. They found references to Daniel, Michael, several other names. Some belonged to people who had disappeared. Others belonged to people who had simply left the area. One entry mentioned Daniel. He followed me. Another. He knows about the room. And then, must move everything. The investigators stopped. What room? They searched the cabin again. The walls were wooden. The floorboards were old. There was no obvious hidden room. Then one investigator noticed something unusual. The bed was positioned against the wall. Behind it was a section of boards that looked newer than the rest. They moved the bed. The boards had been nailed shut. They removed them carefully. Behind the wall was a narrow opening, a hidden compartment. Inside was a small room, barely large enough for one person. There was a chair, a table, a battery-powered radio, several empty boxes, and a collection of photographs. The photographs were organized by date. The investigators began going through them. Some showed the forest, some showed vehicles, some showed campers, and some showed people. Then they found Daniel, a photograph of Daniel standing near his tent, taken from a distance. Another photograph showed Michael, also from a distance. Then there was another person, a woman. She was standing beside a campsite. The date was written on the back. She had disappeared several years before Michael. Another photograph, a man, another missing person case, another date, another campsite. The investigators began to understand what they were looking at. This was not a collection of random photographs. It was an archive. Someone had been documenting people in the forest. But why? Was Elias watching them because he intended to harm them? Or was he watching them because he believed someone else was dangerous? That distinction mattered. Then they found a folder labeled, "The Ones Who Followed." Inside were names, Daniel, Michael, and several others. But the names were divided into two categories, watched and followed. Daniel's name was under followed. Michael's name was also under followed. The recent camper's name was under watched. The investigators stared at the list. Maybe Elias wasn't the person hunting them. Maybe he had been tracking someone else. Then they found a second list. At the top was one word, him. There were no names, only locations, dates, and sightings. One location appeared repeatedly, the old service road. Another was the bunker. Another was the cabin. And another was the RV campsite. The investigators realized something terrifying. Elias had not only been watching the campers, he had been watching someone else. Someone who appeared to move through the same locations. The question became, who was him? Then an investigator found a final photograph. It showed the mysterious man from Daniel's photograph. The same face, the same narrow features, the same mark near the jaw. Elias had photographed him. On the back were 3 words, "He is back." The date was only weeks before the RV incident. The investigators looked at the photograph again, then at the notebook, then at the list. It appeared Elias believed the man had returned to the forest. Suddenly, the stranger outside the RV looked different. Maybe he had not been Elias. Maybe Elias had been watching him. Maybe Elias had been trying to protect campers. Or maybe Elias was part of something much darker. There was still no way to know. The investigators searched the hidden room for more information. Under the table, they found a small cassette recorder. There was one tape inside. They played it. At first, there was only static. Then a man's voice. Low, quiet, difficult to understand. The recording began with a date. Then the voice said, "Daniel knows." Static. A pause. Then, "Michael knows." Another pause. And finally, "If they find the room, they will know." The investigators listened carefully. The voice did not sound like Elias. At least, not obviously. They would need forensic analysis. But before the recording ended, one final sentence could be heard. Very quietly, "Don't let him reach the camps." The tape stopped. The cabin became silent again. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The investigators looked at the photographs, then at the dark forest beyond the window. Someone had been watching. Someone had been followed. Someone had disappeared. And someone might still have been out there. Then one investigator noticed something on the table. A fresh footprint. Not outside. Inside the cabin. It was next to the coffee cup. The investigators had entered through the front door. They had not made that footprint. It was wet. Fresh mud. And it pointed toward the hidden room. Someone had been inside. After they arrived, nobody spoke. The fresh footprint was impossible to ignore. It was inside the cabin, near the hidden room, and it had not been there when the investigators first entered. One investigator slowly raised his flashlight. The beam moved across the wooden walls. The small room was empty. The chair was empty. The table was empty. There was nowhere obvious for another person to hide. Yet the footprint was fresh. Mud still glistened beneath it. They checked the doorway. Locked. They checked the window. Open. The window was large enough for a person to climb through. But outside, there were no obvious fresh footprints beneath it. That meant whoever had entered could have come through the window, or had been inside before the investigators arrived. The investigators immediately moved outside. They searched around the cabin. Nothing. No movement. No voice. No vehicle starting. Only the forest. Then they heard something. A branch breaking. Far behind the cabin. The investigators turned toward the sound. For a moment, they saw nothing. Then another branch moved. Something was moving through the trees. They followed. Slowly. Carefully. The movement continued downhill. Then stopped. One investigator called out, "Police." No answer. He called again. Still nothing. Then from somewhere ahead came a faint sound. A radio. Static. Then a voice. The same voice from the recording. The investigators moved faster. They reached a narrow clearing. There was nobody there. Only an old radio lying on the ground. Still switched on. One investigator picked it up. The frequency was active. Someone had been communicating. But now there was only static. They searched the area. The ground was soft. Fresh footprints were everywhere. One set led toward the old road. Another led toward the cabin. And a third set led deeper into the forest. The third set was different. The tread pattern matched the footprints photographed around the RV. The investigators immediately photographed them. They followed the trail. The footprints continued for nearly half a mile. Then they reached a small stream. The tracks crossed the water. On the other side, they disappeared. But something else was waiting there. A piece of paper attached to a tree. The investigator removed it. There were only 4 words. "You should have left." The message was not signed. But the investigators understood its meaning. Someone knew they were searching. Someone knew they had entered the cabin. And someone wanted them to stop. They returned to the cabin. The hidden room was searched again. This time they found something beneath the floor. A metal hatch. It was almost completely hidden under dirt. The investigators opened it. Below was a narrow tunnel. The tunnel was old, probably constructed decades earlier. It ran beneath the hillside. There were electrical wires along one wall. Some were old. Others looked newer. The investigators followed the tunnel. After approximately 100 feet, it opened into another room. This room was much larger. There were shelves, boxes, camping equipment, old clothes, batteries, food, water, and several sleeping bags. Someone had been using the place. Recently, one investigator opened a box. Inside were personal belongings, wallets, keys, photographs, identification cards. Some belonged to people who had disappeared. Daniel's belongings were there. His old camera, his wallet, a watch, several personal photographs. The investigators stared at them. Daniel had not simply disappeared into the forest. Someone had collected his possessions. Then they found Michael's belongings. His flashlight, his map, his keys, his jacket, everything. The evidence suggested that someone had been keeping the belongings of missing people. But there was no body, no direct evidence of murder, no explanation. One investigator found a shelf containing dozens of small boxes. Each box had a name. Some names belonged to missing people. Some belonged to people who were still alive. Then they saw the camper's name. The box was almost empty. Inside was a photograph of the RV. And one sentence. "Next visit." The investigators immediately understood. The person watching the camper had not finished. They contacted the local authorities and secured the area. Specialists arrived. The tunnel was documented. Every item was photographed. The belongings were collected as evidence. But the mysterious person was gone. Investigators began searching the forest again. This time, they knew what they were looking for. They searched the old roads, the abandoned buildings, the trails, the caves, the streams. Nothing. Then, shortly before sunset, a search team found a vehicle, hidden beneath branches. It was the old truck associated with Elias Ward. The driver's door was open. Inside was a small amount of blood. Not enough to determine what had happened. There was no body. The truck was processed for fingerprints. Several prints were recovered. Some belonged to Elias. Others were unidentified. Investigators also found something in the passenger seat. A notebook, different from the others, newer. The first page contained one sentence. I tried to stop him. The following pages described events over several years. Elias had apparently been watching the mysterious man. He believed the man was responsible for several disappearances. He had tried to gather evidence. He had followed him. He had photographed him. He had tracked his movements. But Elias had also admitted something disturbing. He had been afraid, not of the forest, not of the police, of the man. One entry read, "He knows I am watching." Another, "He knows where I live." And another, "He knows about Daniel." The final page contained only one sentence. "If I disappear, don't believe the story they tell you." The investigators searched for Elias. He was nowhere. His truck had been abandoned. His cabin was empty. His phone was missing, and no one knew where he had gone. The case now involved 3 disappearances. Daniel, Michael, Elias. 3 men connected to the same forest. 3 men who had apparently discovered something, and one unidentified figure who appeared repeatedly in the evidence. But there was still one unanswered question. Why had the stranger approached the RV camper? Why knock? Why ask for a phone? Why say, "You shouldn't be here alone"? The investigators eventually returned to the camper. They showed the photograph of the unidentified man. The camper stared at it. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then the camper said something unexpected. "I've seen him before." The investigators looked at each other. "Where?" The camper pointed at the photograph. "Not here." The camper explained that several months before the camping trip, they had noticed the same man near a gas station. The man had been standing beside a vehicle, watching. The camper had not thought anything of it. They had forgotten about him. Until now. The investigators asked whether the man had spoken to them. No. Had he followed them? The camper wasn't sure. Had the camper seen him anywhere else? There was a long pause. Then, at another campsite, the investigators became silent. Another campsite, another time, another place, but apparently the same man. The camper remembered one more detail. The man had been wearing a dark jacket, and on one hand, a light-colored glove. The same glove. The investigators returned to the evidence. The mysterious man had been watching campers for years. Daniel had seen him. Michael had investigated him. Elias had followed him. And now the camper had encountered him. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was still hidden in the tunnel. Among the boxes of belongings was one final item. A small digital camera. The memory card was still inside. Investigators recovered the files. Most were photographs of the forest. Then came photographs of campers. Then photographs of Daniel. Then Michael. Then Elias. Then the recent RV. And finally, a photograph taken only hours before the investigators arrived at the cabin. It showed the investigators themselves, standing outside the cabin. Someone had been watching them. The photograph showed the investigators standing outside the cabin. It had been taken only hours earlier. That meant someone had been watching them. Not yesterday, not last week, that same day. The investigators immediately secured the camera. They searched the memory card again. There were hundreds of photographs. Most showed the forest, old roads, trails, abandoned structures, but mixed among them were photographs of people, campers, hikers, hunters, families, people who appeared to have no idea they were being photographed. The investigators began sorting the images by date. A pattern slowly emerged. The photographer rarely approached people directly. Instead, they watched from a distance, sometimes from the trees, sometimes from across a road, sometimes from another campsite, and sometimes from inside the forest. Then they found Daniel. Several photographs showed him during the final days before his disappearance. One showed him setting up his tent. Another showed him walking toward the old service road. A third showed him talking to someone. The investigators enlarged the image. The other person was the same man from the earlier photograph. Daniel had not simply encountered the stranger. He had been photographed with him. The next photograph was even more important. It showed Daniel and the unidentified man standing beside the abandoned road. Daniel appeared to be pointing towards something. The stranger was looking in the opposite direction. Neither appeared to be threatening the other. It almost looked like a conversation. The investigators wondered whether Daniel knew the man. Perhaps the stranger had approached him first. Perhaps Daniel had asked questions. Perhaps they had been discussing the abandoned road. Then they found the final photograph of Daniel. It was taken at night. Daniel stood outside his tent. The mysterious man was several yards away, watching him. The timestamp showed that the photograph had been taken shortly before Daniel disappeared. The investigators stared at the image. The man was not hiding. He was simply standing there, watching. The next photograph showed an empty campsite. Daniel was gone. The tent remained. The camera had captured the moment after his disappearance. The investigators searched the metadata. The camera had continued taking photographs after Daniel vanished. For several days, it had been left somewhere near the campsite. Someone had apparently returned to collect it. That person had not been Daniel. The investigators now had a possible timeline. Daniel had discovered the old road. He had encountered the mysterious man. Someone watched him. Daniel disappeared. His belongings were collected, and the photographs were preserved. But why? If the mysterious man was responsible, why keep photographs? Why keep Daniel's belongings? Why keep records of every camper? Perhaps the photographs were trophies. Perhaps they were evidence. Or perhaps they were part of something much more complicated. Then investigators found photographs of Michael. The same pattern. Michael was photographed walking through the forest, examining the old road, entering the bunker, then speaking with someone. The final photograph of Michael showed him standing outside the cabin. After that, nothing. The next photograph was dated 3 years later. It showed the same cabin. Empty. Then another. The bunker. Empty. Then another. A vehicle parked near the forest. Investigators recognized the vehicle. It belonged to Elias. The photographs continued. Elias entering the forest. Elias carrying equipment. Elias looking toward the trees. Then a photograph of Elias standing beside the mysterious man. The two men appeared to be arguing. The image was taken from far away, but their body language was unmistakable. Elias appeared angry. The other man appeared calm. The next photograph showed Elias alone. Then another. Elias looking behind him. Then another. Elias running. The final photograph of Elias showed him near the cabin. After that, nothing. Investigators now understood why Elias had written. I tried to stop him. He had been following the man, and eventually the man had noticed. But the camera contained more. Photographs of other missing people. At least 6. Some cases were known. Others had never been connected to the forest. Investigators began contacting families. They compared photographs. They checked dates. They searched old case files, and slowly connections appeared. People who had visited the forest alone. People who had disappeared. People whose belongings had never been recovered. The forest might have been connected to more cases than anyone realized. But then came the most recent photographs. The RV camper. The investigators' vehicle. The cabin. And finally, a photograph of someone standing near the investigators. The figure was barely visible. It stood behind a tree, watching. The investigators enlarged it. The face was hidden, but the clothing was familiar. Dark jacket, dark pants, one light-colored glove. The same glove. The investigators immediately left the cabin. They searched the surrounding forest. Nothing. The figure was gone. Then one investigator noticed fresh tire tracks. They led away from the cabin. The tracks were new. They followed them toward the old service road. At the end of the road was a gate. The gate had been locked, but the lock was hanging open. Someone had recently passed through. Beyond the gate was a road leading toward the main highway. Investigators followed. Several miles later, they found an abandoned vehicle. Inside was a small bag. The bag contained clothes, food, cash, and a passport. The passport belonged to Elias Ward. That meant Elias might still be alive. He might have escaped, or someone might have taken his belongings. There was no way to know. The investigators searched the vehicle. Under the driver's seat was another photograph. This one showed Elias. He was sitting inside the cabin. On the back were the words, "He knows I'm leaving." The investigators checked the date. It had been taken 2 days before Elias disappeared. Then they found something else. A handwritten address. Not in the forest. Not near the cabin. A town several hours away. The investigators contacted local authorities in that area. They searched the address. The house was empty, but a neighbor remembered seeing a man matching Elias's description. He had been there recently. Very recently. The neighbor said something else. A second man had visited him. A man wearing dark clothing, and according to the neighbor, one of his hands had been covered by a light-colored glove. The investigators now had their strongest lead. The mysterious man might still be alive, and he might have been searching for Elias. But before they could identify him, the investigation received a shocking development. The forensic team examined the handwriting in the notebook. They compared it against samples recovered from the cabin. The writing was not Elias's, not Daniel's, not Michael's, not Thomas's. The notebook had been written by someone else, someone who had been documenting all of them. The investigators returned to the photographs. They looked again at the unidentified man. Then they compared the man's face with old photographs. This time, they found a possible match. A photograph from a local newspaper, taken many years earlier. The person in the image looked remarkably similar. Same face, same build, same mark near the jaw. The man's name was Victor Crane. He had worked as a contractor in the area. He had occasionally been involved with forestry projects. And according to old records, he had access to the abandoned roads. But there was one problem. Victor Crane had supposedly died years earlier. A death certificate existed. The date of death was recorded. The burial had taken place. The case should have been closed. The investigators examined the death records. Something didn't look right. The records contained inconsistencies. The identity of the deceased had never been independently confirmed. The family had not publicly released photographs. And the funeral had been private. Could Victor Crane have faked his own death? It was only a theory. But if true, it would explain how the same man could appear across decades. The investigators searched historical photographs. Victor appeared in images from years before Daniel disappeared. The face matched. The mark near the jaw matched. And in one photograph, he wore the same distinctive ring. The investigators stared at the image. The identity of the mysterious man finally seemed to have a name. Victor Crane. But the story was not over, because the final photograph on the camera had not been taken in the forest. It had been taken at a roadside gas station. The date was recent. The photograph showed Victor standing beside a vehicle. And across the parking lot stood the RV camper. Victor had been watching them before the camping trip. He had followed them. He had known where they were going. And he had waited until they were alone. The investigator looked at the photograph again, then noticed something in Victor's hand. A small object. A phone. And on the screen was a photograph of the investigators, taken that same day. The investigators stared at the photograph. Victor Crane stood across the gas station parking lot. The RV was visible behind him, and on the screen of the phone in his hand was a photograph of the investigators themselves. Someone had been watching them. Someone knew where they were. Someone knew what they were investigating. And according to the official records, Victor Crane had been dead for years. The investigators immediately contacted the department responsible for the original death record. They requested every document connected to Victor's reported death. The file was surprisingly thin. There was a death certificate, a burial record, a hospital document, and a short police report. But there was no photograph of the body, no dental confirmation, no fingerprint identification, no DNA confirmation. The investigator read the report carefully. Victor had supposedly died after a vehicle accident. The vehicle had burned badly. The remains had been too damaged for visual identification. The body had been identified through personal belongings found inside the vehicle. That was a problem, because personal belongings could be planted. The investigators requested the original accident photographs. The photographs showed a completely destroyed vehicle. But one detail stood out. The license plate belonged to Victor. The vehicle identification number also appeared to match. Yet there was no reliable evidence proving the person inside the vehicle was actually Victor. The investigators began considering the possibility that Victor had staged his death. If he had done it successfully, for years. But why? Why would someone disappear officially, only to continue living near the same forest? Why would he watch campers? Why would he keep photographs? Why would he document Daniel, Michael, and Elias? The investigators returned to the cabin. They searched everything again. This time, they were looking specifically for evidence of Victor's identity. They found old receipts, old photographs, tools, clothing, a few books. Nothing definitive. Then they discovered a small envelope hidden behind a loose board. Inside was a newspaper clipping. It was from the year Victor supposedly died. The headline announced his death. Someone had circled the article in black ink. Underneath, one sentence had been written. "Everyone believes it." The handwriting matched the unknown writer of the notebook. The investigators now had strong evidence that the death had been staged. But there was another question. Who was the person who had helped Victor? Because staging a death required planning, a vehicle, a false trail, access to records, and someone willing to remain silent. They searched Victor's old contacts. One name appeared repeatedly: Thomas Hale. The investigators returned to Thomas. They showed him the newspaper clipping. Thomas stared at it. He didn't deny knowing about Victor. Instead, he finally admitted, "Victor isn't dead." The investigators asked him where Victor was. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know." "You're lying." "No." "Then tell us what you do know." Thomas looked exhausted. Then he said, "Victor wasn't hiding from the police." "Who was he hiding from?" Thomas looked toward the window. "The people who were looking for him." The investigators asked who those people were. Thomas refused to give names, but he finally explained why Daniel and Michael had become involved. Years earlier, Victor had discovered something in the forest. Something connected to the abandoned service roads. Something that had been happening there for years. "What?" Thomas said. "I never saw all of it." "But you saw enough?" Thomas nodded. Victor had apparently discovered that people were using the forest for illegal activity. Vehicles entered through old roads. Equipment was moved at night. People met in hidden locations. Some of the activity appeared connected to stolen goods. Other parts were never identified. Victor began documenting what he saw. Photographs, dates, vehicles, people. Daniel eventually noticed the same activity. He began asking questions. Michael became involved later, and Elias apparently followed them. But investigators still didn't understand the disappearances. Thomas insisted Victor wasn't responsible for Daniel's disappearance. He claimed Victor had been trying to protect himself, and perhaps protect others. Then the investigators asked the most important question. "Where is Daniel?" Thomas looked down. "I don't know." "Dead?" "I don't know." "Alive?" Another pause. "I don't know." The investigators became frustrated. "Then what happened?" Thomas finally said, "Daniel followed the wrong person." "Who?" Thomas whispered. "Not Victor." The room became silent. The investigators had assumed Victor was the central figure. But Thomas was suggesting someone else existed. Someone Victor himself feared. The investigators asked for a name. Thomas refused. They asked again. Nothing. Finally, Thomas said, "You've already seen him." The investigators immediately thought of the photograph. The mysterious man. The dark clothing. The light-colored glove. Victor had been photographing him. Victor had been afraid of him. And apparently, Victor was not the person they should have been looking for. The investigators returned to the forest. They examined the old photographs again. They found Victor. They found Daniel. They found Michael. They found Elias. And then they noticed something. In several photographs, a second figure appeared. Not always clearly. Sometimes only a shadow. Sometimes a person standing behind a tree. Sometimes a reflection in a vehicle window. But the same figure seemed to appear repeatedly. The investigators compared dates. The figure appeared before Daniel disappeared, before Michael disappeared, before Elias disappeared, and before the recent RV incident. Whoever it was had been there for years. Then they found one photograph that changed everything. It showed Victor standing near the forest. Beside him was another man, the same unidentified figure. But this time, the face was partially visible, and unlike the previous photographs, The image was clear enough to recognize him. The investigators ran the photograph through old records. Within hours, they had a name: Samuel Reed. Samuel had once worked alongside Victor. He had access to the forest. He knew the abandoned roads, and according to employment records, he had worked at the same company as Daniel. But Samuel had disappeared from the area shortly before Daniel vanished. He had moved away, or so everyone believed. The investigators searched his records. His last known address was abandoned. His phone number was disconnected. His employment history stopped. There were no recent photographs, no social media, no obvious financial activity. It looked as if Samuel had simply disappeared. Then they found something: a vehicle registration, a truck registered under another name. The registration had been connected to a property only a few miles from the forest. Investigators went there. The property appeared abandoned, but there were fresh tire tracks, fresh footprints, and a light coming from inside the building. The investigators approached carefully. They entered. Nobody was there, but on a table was a photograph. The investigators looked at it. Their faces went pale. It showed the RV camper, the same RV, the same campsite, the same night, and standing beside the RV was Samuel Reed. The photograph had been taken shortly before the knocking. The investigators now knew who the stranger was. At least, they believed they did. But there was one final question. Why had Samuel knocked on the RV door? They searched the building. Behind a cabinet was a small metal box. Inside was a handwritten note. Only one sentence: "I warned them. They didn't listen." Underneath it was another photograph. Daniel, Michael, Elias, Victor, the RV camper, and Samuel, all connected by the same forest. But on the back of the photograph was something even more disturbing. A date: tomorrow. The investigators looked at the calendar. Tomorrow was already approaching, and somewhere in the forest, someone appeared to be preparing for another visit. The word remained in the investigators' minds: tomorrow. It was written on the back of the photograph. Not a date from years ago. Not a date connected to Daniel. Not a date connected to Michael or Elias. It referred to the future. Someone had planned something, and apparently that something involved the RV camper. The investigators immediately contacted the camper again. They told the camper not to return to the forest. The camper agreed, but there was a problem. The camper had already made plans to leave the area the following morning. They were going to drive through the same region. The investigators asked them to change their route. They did. At least, that was what everyone believed. Meanwhile, investigators surrounded the abandoned property where they had found Samuel's photograph. They searched the building again. There was no Samuel, no vehicle, no obvious way to determine where he had gone. But they found a map. The map showed several locations around the forest. One location was circled: the old service road. Another was marked with 3 lines: the bunker. And another location was marked with a single letter: R. The investigators tried to determine what R meant. Then one of them remembered the RV campsite. Its location began with the same letter on an older map. They checked. The mark was only a few hundred yards from where the camper had originally parked. Someone had planned to return there. The investigators decided to set up surveillance. They positioned cameras along the old road. They monitored the cabin. They watched the bunker. They waited. Nothing happened during the afternoon. Nothing happened at sunset. The forest became dark. Still nothing. At approximately 11:30 p.m., one of the cameras detected movement. A person entered the forest, walking alone. The investigators watched the monitor. The person moved toward the cabin. They zoomed in. Dark clothing, dark pants, one light-colored glove. The investigators prepared to move. But before they could reach the cabin, another person appeared, walking from the opposite direction. 2 people, not one. The first person stopped. The second approached. They stood several feet apart. For several minutes, neither moved. Then the second person raised a hand. The first person stepped backward. The investigators watched through the camera. They could not hear the conversation, but they could see the body language. The meeting appeared tense. Then one person turned toward the cabin. The other disappeared into the trees. The investigators followed the first. It was Samuel. He entered the cabin. The investigators waited. then moved in. They entered silently. The cabin was empty. Samuel had disappeared through the hidden tunnel. They followed. The tunnel led toward the bunker. But Samuel wasn't there. Another passage existed, a narrow opening behind the storage shelves. It led even deeper underground. The investigators followed. After several minutes, they reached a large underground room. And there, they found Samuel. He was sitting at a table. He did not run. He simply looked at them. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then one investigator asked, "Where is Victor?" Samuel looked down. "He's gone." "Where?" "I don't know." "You're lying." Samuel shook his head. "No." The investigators asked about Daniel. Samuel remained silent. They asked about Michael. Silence. Elias. Nothing. Finally, they asked about the RV camper. Samuel looked directly at them. He wasn't supposed to be there. The investigator asked, "Who?" Samuel answered, "Victor." The investigators were confused. Samuel explained that Victor had been watching the area for years. He had been collecting evidence, but he was not the person responsible for the disappearances. He had been trying to identify the person who was. The investigators asked for the name. Samuel said, "I don't know his real name, but you know him." Samuel nodded. "I've known him for years." "Then why haven't you reported him?" Samuel looked toward the tunnel. "Because every time someone tries..." He stopped. "Someone disappears." The investigators asked what happened to Daniel. Samuel finally spoke. "Daniel found the room." "What room?" "The first one." There were apparently multiple hidden rooms throughout the forest. Old structures, tunnels, storage areas, places built decades earlier. Some had been abandoned. Others had been secretly maintained. Daniel had discovered one. He photographed it. He told Michael. Michael began investigating. Elias followed. Victor became involved. And eventually, all of them became targets. The investigator asked, "Where is Daniel?" Samuel closed his eyes. "I don't know." "Is he dead?" "I never saw him die." That answer was important. Samuel had not confirmed Daniel's death. Then where could he be? Samuel shook his head. "I don't know." The investigator placed the photograph on the table. The photograph of Daniel. The photograph of Michael. The photograph of Elias. Then the photograph of the mysterious figure. "Who is this?" Samuel looked at it. For the first time, his expression changed. Fear. Real fear. "That's him." "Who?" Samuel whispered. "The man who never leaves." The investigators demanded an explanation. Samuel said the man had used several names. Different identities. Different addresses. Different jobs. He appeared in different places over many years. But Samuel believed it was the same person. "How is that possible?" Samuel answered, "He doesn't live like us." The investigators pressed him. Samuel finally explained. The man rarely stayed in one place. He had hidden locations throughout the region. When people discovered one, he abandoned it. He watched. He waited. He moved. And he chose people who were alone. The investigators asked why. Samuel said, "Because nobody hears you scream when you're alone." The room became silent. Then Samuel said something else. "The knocking isn't the dangerous part." The investigator looked at him. "What is?" Samuel replied, "When he knocks." He paused. "He's checking whether someone is awake." That changed the meaning of the entire RV incident. The stranger wasn't simply asking for help. He was testing the camper, watching the reaction, learning whether anyone else was inside. The investigators asked what happened after someone answered. Samuel said, "Sometimes nothing. Sometimes they disappear." The investigator asked how many. Samuel didn't know. Dozens, perhaps. Maybe more. Some cases were reported. Some were never connected to the forest. Some people had simply vanished from their normal lives. The investigator asked why Samuel had stayed involved. He said, "Because I thought I could stop him." And Victor? He thought the same thing. Elias? Same. Michael? Samuel nodded. Daniel? Samuel looked away. Daniel was the first one who got close. The investigator asked. "Close to what?" Samuel pointed toward the tunnel. the truth. Before they could ask another question, the lights went out. The entire underground room became dark. The investigators raised their flashlights. Samuel stood up. "He's here." A sound came from the tunnel. Slow footsteps. One step, then another, then another. The investigators pointed their weapons toward the entrance. Samuel backed away. The footsteps stopped. Silence. Then came 3 knocks. Not on a door, on the metal wall of the tunnel. Knock, knock, knock. Samuel whispered, "Don't answer." Nobody moved. A shadow appeared at the far end of the tunnel. A person was standing there. Dark clothing, dark pants, one light-colored glove. The investigators raised their flashlights. The beam reached the man's face. For the first time, they saw him clearly. It was not Victor. It was not Samuel. It was not Elias. It was someone else. Someone whose identity had been hidden for years. And when Samuel saw the face, he whispered one name, Daniel. The investigators froze. The flashlight beam remained fixed on the figure at the end of the tunnel. Samuel was staring at him. His face had gone completely pale. Then, barely above a whisper, he said, "Daniel." Nobody moved. The man took one slow step forward. The light revealed his face. Older, thinner. His hair had changed. There were deep lines around his eyes. But there was no doubt. Samuel knew him. And according to every official record in the case, Daniel Mercer had disappeared decades ago. One investigator lowered his flashlight slightly. "Daniel?" The man didn't answer. He simply stood there. His breathing was heavy. His clothes were dirty. There were scratches along his hands. He looked like someone who had spent a very long time underground. Samuel took a step toward him. "Daniel, is it really you?" The man finally spoke. His voice was rough, almost unfamiliar, but the words were clear. "Samuel." The investigators looked at each other. They had expected a killer. They had expected a stranger. They had expected Victor. They had never expected the missing man himself. The investigator asked Daniel where he had been. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the tunnel behind him. Then he said, "You're not supposed to be here." The investigator replied, "We've been looking for you." Daniel gave a tired smile. "That's the problem." He walked closer. The investigators could see the scars on his hands. Some were old. Some looked recent. He had survived something. "But what?" Samuel asked. "Where have you been all these years?" Daniel looked at him. "Here." Samuel shook his head. "No." Daniel nodded. "Not always here." The investigators asked him to explain. Daniel sat down at the table. He looked exhausted. Then he began. The night he disappeared, Daniel had followed the stranger. He had discovered the old road. He had seen vehicles entering the forest. He had watched people carrying boxes into one of the hidden structures. He believed he had discovered an illegal operation. But he had misunderstood one thing. The people using the forest were not the most dangerous part. There was someone watching them too. Someone who had been watching everyone. Daniel had encountered that person. They spoke. The man knew Daniel's name. He knew where Daniel lived. He knew Daniel had been taking photographs. And he knew Daniel had shown them to Michael. Daniel asked how he knew. The man simply said, "I've been watching you." Daniel tried to leave. He never made it back to his campsite. He was taken underground. Not immediately to the bunker. To another location. A place Daniel called the first room. There, he discovered photographs. Hundreds of them. People. Campsites. Vehicles. Families. Hikers. Hunters. Missing people. And photographs of Daniel himself. Daniel realized he had not been the first person. He had simply become the latest. The investigators asked, "Why didn't you escape?" Daniel looked at them. "I tried." He explained that the tunnels were larger than anyone realized. They connected different parts of the forest. Some entrances were hidden beneath buildings. Others were concealed beneath rocks. Some were underwater. The person who controlled them knew every route. Daniel escaped once. He reached the surface, but he had no idea where he was. He walked for hours. Then he saw someone. A vehicle. He tried to approach. But the driver was not a stranger. It was the same man. Daniel was taken back. Years passed. Daniel eventually learned how to survive. He stopped trying to escape blindly. Instead, he began learning. The routes, the rooms, the schedules, the hiding places, the people involved. And eventually, he found another prisoner. Michael. The investigators stared at him. Michael had been alive, at least for some time. Daniel explained that Michael had been brought there years later. He had been investigating the same network. He knew about Daniel. He had been searching for him. And eventually, he found him. What happened to Michael? Daniel looked down. He escaped. The investigators asked, "Where is he?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know." Michael had escaped through another tunnel. Daniel never saw him again. But before Michael left, he promised to return with help. He never came back. The investigators asked about Elias. Daniel said Elias had also discovered the tunnels. But Elias had been more cautious. He watched from a distance. He photographed everything. He was the one who had created some of the hidden records. And Victor? Daniel's expression changed. "Victor helped me." The investigators asked how. Daniel explained that Victor had discovered the truth years before. He had staged his death because the people involved were getting close to him. He continued watching the forest from a distance. He collected evidence. He photographed the people responsible. He tried to find Daniel. But Victor had eventually disappeared too. Daniel didn't know whether he was alive. The investigators asked about Samuel. Daniel looked toward him. Samuel tried to help. Samuel lowered his head. But he got scared. Samuel admitted it. He had been afraid. He had wanted to expose everything. But every time he got close, someone disappeared. The investigators asked the most important question. Who was the man responsible? Daniel looked toward the tunnel entrance. He had many names. What's his real name? Daniel shook his head. I never knew. But you saw him? Yes. You know what he looks like? Yes. Then why can't we identify him? Daniel looked at the investigator. Because he doesn't exist. The investigator frowned. What does that mean? Daniel explained. The man had built his life around false identities. Every few years he disappeared. He became someone else. A different name. A different job. A different home. Sometimes he even used the identities of dead people. The investigators thought about Victor. The fake death. The false records. The abandoned addresses. The missing identities. Then Daniel said something that changed the entire case. Victor learned how to do it from him. The investigators looked at each other. Victor had not invented the system. He had learned it. The man had been operating for decades, perhaps longer, and he had taught others how to disappear. Then Daniel reached into his jacket. He removed a small piece of paper. He placed it on the table. It contained several names. The investigators recognized some. Daniel, Michael, Elias, Victor, Samuel, and one final name. The investigator read it, then looked up. Who is this? Daniel answered. The person who started it. Before he could explain, the lights came back on. The tunnel was empty. The investigators turned. The man who had been standing there was gone. No footsteps. No sound. Nothing. Samuel rushed toward the tunnel. He stopped after a few yards. There was a metal door. It had been closed. They opened it. Beyond it was another passage. But there were fresh footprints. The mysterious man had escaped. Daniel stood behind them. He looked exhausted. Then he said, "He knows you're here now." The investigator asked, "Will he come back?" Daniel looked at him. "He always does." Outside, dawn was beginning. The forest was slowly becoming visible. After decades of unanswered questions, investigators finally had something they had never had before. A living witness. A missing man who had returned. Evidence of hidden tunnels. Photographs. Records. And proof that the disappearances were connected. But Daniel's return created another mystery. If he had survived all these years, where was Michael? Where was Elias? Where was Victor? And who was the man who had controlled the forest? Daniel looked toward the trees, then said quietly, "You're asking the wrong question." The investigator turned. "What should we ask?" Daniel replied, "Why did he let me come back?" The question remained unanswered. Why had the man allowed Daniel to return? For decades, investigators had assumed Daniel Mercer was dead. His disappearance had become one of those cases people eventually stopped talking about. His family had waited. Friends had searched. Authorities had followed leads that went nowhere. And now Daniel was standing in front of them, alive. But Daniel himself seemed almost as disturbed by his return as the investigators were. They moved him out of the underground room. Daniel walked slowly. He had difficulty adjusting to the daylight. After spending so much time underground, the open sky seemed to overwhelm him. He stopped several times, then looked toward the trees. "He'll be watching," the investigator asked. "Who?" Daniel didn't answer. They brought Daniel to a secure location. Medical specialists examined him. He was weak, malnourished, covered in old scars, but he was conscious and able to speak. The investigators wanted answers. Daniel needed rest. Eventually, he agreed to continue. The first question was simple. Why had he stayed? Daniel looked down at his hands. "I didn't stay." He explained that he had escaped several times, but every escape attempt had failed. The forest was too large. The tunnels were too confusing, and the man always seemed to know where he was. One time Daniel reached a road. He saw headlights. He thought someone would help him. Instead, the vehicle stopped. The driver was the same man. Daniel was taken back. Another time, Daniel reached a town. He entered a store. He tried to ask for help, but before he could explain anything, he saw the man standing outside, watching through the window. Daniel panicked. He ran, and once again, he disappeared. The investigators asked why Daniel never went to the police. Daniel gave a simple answer. "Because I didn't know who I could trust." That sentence stayed with them. The man had created more than physical fear. He had created uncertainty. Anyone could potentially be connected. A driver, a worker, a stranger, even someone who appeared to be helping. Then Daniel explained something else. The man rarely hurt people immediately. He watched them first. He studied their routines, their habits, their vehicles, their friends, their families. He waited. Sometimes he approached them. Sometimes he followed them. Sometimes he simply watched. And when someone discovered too much, they disappeared. The investigators asked, "Why the campers?" Daniel answered, "Because they are isolated. People camping alone were easy to observe. Nobody knew exactly where they were. Nobody noticed if they changed their plans. And if they disappeared, their absence could initially be blamed on an accident." Daniel said the man had used the forest for years because it gave him control. There were abandoned roads, old buildings, hidden tunnels, places without cell coverage, and enormous stretches of land where nobody could hear anything. Then Daniel said, "He didn't choose the forest." The investigator looked at him. "What do you mean?" "He inherited it." The investigators asked him to explain. Daniel said the tunnels were older than the man. Some had been built decades earlier, possibly much earlier. The man had simply discovered them, then expanded them, connected them, and turned them into a private network. The investigators asked who built the original tunnels. Daniel didn't know, but he remembered finding old markings, dates, names, and symbols carved into the walls. The three-line symbol, the same symbol investigators had found near the campsite. Daniel said the symbol had a meaning. It marked a safe route, a route that could be used without being seen. The investigators asked who used it. Daniel said, everyone who knew. That included Victor, Michael, Elias, Samuel, and possibly others. The investigators showed Daniel the photograph of Victor. Daniel recognized him immediately. Victor tried to expose him. Did Victor know his real identity? Daniel shook his head. No. What about Michael? Michael got closer. How close? Daniel looked away. Closer than anyone. The investigators asked what Michael discovered. Daniel said Michael found a room containing records. Not photographs. Not belongings. Records. Names. Dates. Locations. And something else. Payments. The man had apparently been receiving money. The investigators asked from whom. Daniel didn't know. Michael had discovered financial records connected to different companies. Some legitimate, some impossible to identify. Money moved through shell businesses, property companies, construction firms, transport companies. The forest operation might have been larger than one person. Much larger. The investigators asked whether Daniel knew who was paying him. Daniel said no, but Michael had believed the man was working for someone powerful enough to protect him. That could explain why the man had survived for so long. Why police records had failed to connect him. Why people disappeared without obvious evidence. Why identities could be changed. The investigators asked about the note. I warned them. They didn't listen. Daniel said that note had not been written by Samuel. It had been written by Michael. The investigators were stunned. Michael had written it before his disappearance. Daniel explained that Michael had discovered the network was bigger than they thought. He wanted to expose it. He believed he could reach the authorities. But he never made it. Or so they thought. The investigators asked, "Did Michael die?" Daniel answered, "I don't know." Again, that same uncertainty. No body. No confirmed death. No final evidence. Then Daniel mentioned something else. Michael had escaped. He had reached the surface. He had taken several documents. He had promised to return. But Daniel never saw him again. The investigators searched old missing person records. Michael's case was reopened. But there was no immediate evidence that he was alive. Then came the question about Elias. Daniel said Elias had helped them. He had secretly brought food, batteries, maps. He had photographed the tunnels. But eventually, Elias disappeared too. The investigators asked, "Did the man kill Elias?" Daniel said, "I don't know." Daniel had learned something during captivity. The man wanted people to believe he was responsible. Fear was useful. If people believed he was everywhere, they became easier to control. That meant some disappearances might not have been caused by him. Some people could have escaped. Some could have left voluntarily. Some could have been killed by someone else. And some might still be alive. The investigators now had a much bigger problem. They had to separate fact from fear. They returned to the forest. Every hidden structure was searched. Every tunnel was mapped. Every photograph was cataloged. Every unidentified person was investigated. Then they discovered a room Daniel had never mentioned. It was behind the oldest tunnel. Inside were boxes. The boxes contained identity documents, passports, driver's licenses, birth certificates, names, hundreds of them. Some belonged to dead people. Some belonged to missing people. Some belonged to people who were still alive. The investigators realized what they were looking at. An identity library. The man had collected identities. If he needed to disappear, he could become someone else. And then they found one document that stopped the investigation cold. A driver's license. A photograph. A name. The investigators recognized the face. It belonged to a person who had been interviewed during the original investigation into Daniel's disappearance. A person who had claimed to know nothing. But the photograph on the license showed something else. The same mark near the jaw. The same eyes. The same man. The mysterious figure had been hiding in plain sight. The investigators searched the identity. The name belonged to a man who had supposedly died years earlier. Again, another dead identity. Another false trail. Daniel looked at the photograph. He recognized him, but he didn't say the name. Instead, he whispered, "That's not who he is." The investigator asked, "Then who is he?" Daniel stared at the photograph, then answered, "I don't know." Outside, the forest was getting dark. The investigators had finally found Daniel. But instead of closing the mystery, his return had opened an even larger one. Because Daniel had survived. Michael might have survived. Elias might have survived. Victor might still be alive. And the man who had been watching them was still free. Then Daniel received a message. A photograph had been delivered to the investigators. No envelope. No fingerprints. No explanation. Just one photograph. It showed Daniel sitting inside the secure room. The photograph had been taken after he returned. On the back were 5 words. "You should have stayed hidden." The photograph was placed on the table. Daniel stared at it. For the first time since he had returned, he looked genuinely frightened. The investigators had seen him afraid before. But this was different. He knew exactly what the photograph meant. Someone had taken it after he was rescued. Someone had entered a secure location. Someone had been close enough to photograph him without being noticed. The investigator asked, "Who took this?" Daniel didn't answer. Daniel, who could get inside? Daniel finally looked up. Nobody. Then how? Daniel shook his head. He doesn't need to get inside. The investigators didn't understand. Daniel pointed toward the photograph. He's been watching through the whole time. They immediately secured the room. Every window, every door, every hallway. Security footage was reviewed. No unauthorized person had entered. The cameras showed nothing unusual. Yet the photograph existed. Then an investigator noticed something in the background. A small object on the wall. A smoke detector. They examined it. Inside was a tiny camera. The room went silent. Someone had installed surveillance equipment. But the question was, when? The device was removed. Technicians examined it. It had been operating for several days. Long enough to record Daniel's arrival. Long enough to record investigators discussing the case. Long enough to capture private conversations. Someone had been listening. The investigators immediately assumed the hidden camera had been installed by the same person behind the Forrest disappearances. But Daniel disagreed. No. The investigator looked at him. No. Daniel shook his head. That's not his style. Then whose? Daniel answered. Someone helping him. That possibility was worse. If someone had access to the secure location, the investigation could be compromised from inside. The investigators began reviewing everyone who had entered the building. Doctors, officers, technicians, security personnel, administrative staff, contractors. Anyone could have installed the camera. Then they found another device. This one inside a hallway light. Then another. Inside a ventilation panel. The building had been compromised. The investigators moved Daniel to another location. This time, they used a completely secure facility. No electronic devices. No unnecessary personnel. No outside visitors. Daniel was placed in a private room. Before the investigators left, Daniel stopped them. There is something you need to know. They turned. The photograph wasn't a warning. What was it? Daniel looked toward the door. It was proof. Proof of what? That he knows where I am. The investigators understood. The photograph wasn't meant to frighten Daniel. It was meant to tell him, I can still reach you. That night, investigators returned to the forest. They searched the old cabin again. Inside the hidden room, they discovered another photograph. This one showed the secure building, taken from across the street. The timestamp was from the same day. The investigators looked at each other. Someone had been watching the building. They searched the surrounding streets. Nothing, but security footage from a nearby business showed a dark vehicle parked across the road. The vehicle remained there for several hours. Investigators traced the license plate. The plate belonged to a man who had died 11 years earlier. Another false identity. They traced the vehicle itself. It had been purchased using cash. No useful records. No fingerprints. No obvious owner. But there was one thing inside. A map. The map showed several locations. The secure building. The forest. The cabin. The bunker. And one additional location. A house. The investigators recognized the address. It belonged to Daniel's family. They immediately sent officers there. The house was empty. Nothing appeared disturbed. Then an officer noticed something outside. Fresh footprints near the back door. Inside the house was a photograph. It showed Daniel as a young man, standing with his family. On the back was written, he always wanted to go home. Daniel had not yet been told. The investigators feared the man was sending a message. He knew where Daniel's family lived. He knew where Daniel was. He knew where the investigators were. The investigation was no longer confined to the forest. Then came another discovery. The handwriting expert compared the message with the old notebook. It matched. The same writer. The same person who had documented Daniel. Michael. Elias. Victor. The RV camper. The investigators. The unknown writer was still alive. They searched every photograph for a clue. Then one image caught their attention. A photograph of the mysterious man standing beside a vehicle. The vehicle was old, but in the reflection of the window, another person could be seen. A woman. The investigators enlarged the reflection. The woman's face was visible. She looked familiar. One investigator recognized her from an old missing person file. She had disappeared 20 years earlier. But according to the file, her case had been closed. Her body had supposedly been found. The investigators reopened the file. The identification was based on personal belongings. Again, no DNA, no fingerprints, no confirmed photograph of the body. Another false death. Another person who might have survived. The investigators began to understand the scale of the problem. It wasn't simply one man hiding in the forest. There might be an entire network of people who had disappeared by choice, or had been forced to disappear. Some identities had been stolen. Some deaths had been fabricated. Some missing people might still be alive. And somewhere among them was the man they were looking for. Then Daniel made an unexpected request. He wanted to return to the forest. The investigators refused. Daniel insisted. "I need to show you something." "What?" "The place where it started." After hours of discussion, they agreed. Daniel was taken back under heavy security. They entered the forest during daylight. Daniel walked slowly. He remembered the path. He led them beyond the bunker, beyond the cabin, beyond the old service road. Eventually, they reached an area investigators had never searched. A steep hillside covered in trees. Daniel stopped. "This is where I first saw him." There was nothing obvious. Just trees, rocks, leaves. Then Daniel moved toward a large tree. He touched the trunk. 3 lines were carved into the bark. The investigators recognized the symbol. Daniel looked at them. "This isn't a trail marker." "What is it?" Daniel answered. "It's a door." He pushed against the tree. Nothing happened. Then he moved a stone near the roots. A hidden mechanism clicked. The ground shifted slightly. A concealed entrance opened beneath the leaves. Darkness appeared below. The investigators looked into the opening. A staircase descended into the earth. Daniel stared down. "I never went back after I escaped." One investigator switched on his flashlight. The beam disappeared into the darkness. They began descending, step by step. At the bottom was a room. Unlike the others, this one was clean, recently used. There was a table, a chair, a lamp, and a wall covered with photographs. The investigators approached. Every photograph showed the same man, the mysterious figure. But this time, the photographs were not of victims. They were photographs of the investigators themselves. The newest photograph had been taken that morning. It showed Daniel standing at the entrance to the hidden room, and beside him stood one of the investigators. The investigator stared at the image, then slowly turned around. Daniel was looking at him. "What's wrong?" The investigator didn't answer, because the photograph had been taken from directly behind them. There was nowhere in the room where a photographer could have been standing. Then the lamp went out. Darkness filled the room, and somewhere behind them, a quiet voice whispered, "You finally found me." The voice came from somewhere behind them. Quiet, calm, almost impossible to locate. "You finally found me." For a moment, nobody moved. The investigator's flashlight was still pointed toward the wall. Daniel stood near the entrance. The other investigator slowly turned. Nothing, only darkness. Then the emergency light flickered. For less than a second, the room became visible. A chair, a table, the photographs, the staircase, and a dark figure standing near the opposite wall. The light disappeared again. "Don't move," Daniel whispered. The investigators raised their weapons. The room remained silent. Then footsteps began. Slow, measured. One step, then another. The sound came from the far side of the room. The emergency light returned. The figure was gone. The investigators rushed toward the wall. There was no door, no opening, no passage, nothing. But Daniel immediately noticed something. A section of the wall had moved. He pressed against it. The panel opened. Behind it was another tunnel. Daniel stared into the darkness. "He built this one after I escaped." The investigators entered. The tunnel was narrow. Fresh electrical cables ran along the ceiling. That meant someone had been using it recently. They followed the passage. After several minutes, they reached another room. This room was different. It looked almost like an office. There was a desk, a computer, several monitors, and hundreds of photographs. The investigators looked at the screens. One showed the forest. Another showed the cabin. Another showed the old service road. Another showed the secure facility where Daniel had been taken. Someone had live access to the cameras. The investigator stepped toward the desk. The computer screen displayed a list of names: Daniel Mercer, Michael Rowan, Elias Ward, Victor Crane, Samuel Reed, and several others. But beneath those names was another category. Currently active. Only 2 names appeared: Daniel and one investigator. The investigator stared at his own name. Daniel saw it. He's choosing you. Why me? Daniel shook his head. Because you found too much. The computer suddenly changed. A video began playing. It showed Daniel, years earlier, inside the forest. The footage was grainy. Daniel was talking to someone. The investigator watched carefully. The person speaking to Daniel was Victor. Victor said, "You have to leave." Daniel replied, "I'm not leaving." Victor looked frightened. "Then you'll disappear." The video ended. Another began. This one showed Michael. Michael was inside the same room. He was holding documents. He looked directly at the camera, then said, "If anyone finds this, don't trust the photographs." The screen went black. The investigator looked at Daniel. What did he mean? Daniel answered, "The photographs can be manipulated." That was a critical discovery. The photographs had been evidence, but perhaps some of them had been deliberately created to tell a false story. Daniel explained that the man had used photographs to control what people believed. He could make someone appear to be somewhere they had never been. He could make it look like someone had followed another person. He could create suspicion. He could make innocent people appear guilty. The investigator looked at the wall of photographs. "Then how do we know which ones are real?" Daniel replied, "We don't." The computer suddenly displayed a new message. "You have 10 minutes. The investigator looked around. "What happens in 10 minutes? Daniel didn't answer. He already knew. A countdown appeared. 9:59, 9:58, 9:57. The investigators searched the room. They found another door. Locked. A keypad was mounted beside it. Daniel examined the numbers. "I've seen this before. What's the code?" "I don't know." The countdown continued. 8:42, 8:41. They searched the desk. Drawers, shelves, boxes. Nothing. Then Daniel noticed something. 3 lines had been carved into the desk. The same symbol. He pressed the lines. A small panel opened. Inside was a note. The note contained 4 numbers. 1974. Daniel entered them. The door unlocked. Beyond the door was a much larger chamber. The walls were covered with files. Thousands of pages. Names. Dates. Locations. Payments. Photographs. This was the central archive. The investigators immediately began searching for Daniel's name. They found a file. Inside were reports from the years following his disappearance. Someone had continued documenting Daniel, his family, his friends, the police, every major development in the investigation. Someone had watched the investigation from the beginning. Then they found Michael's file. It contained the same type of information, but one page was different. It had been added recently. The page contained a single sentence. "He escaped again." The date was only 3 months old. The investigators stared at it. Michael might still be alive. They searched Elias's file. Another recent entry. Still looking. Victor's file. Another recent entry. "He knows." Samuel's file. Compromised. Then they found another name. A woman. The same woman whose photograph had appeared in the forest. Her file contained one sentence. "Alive." The investigators realized the impossible. Several people believed to be dead or permanently missing might still be alive. Then they heard footsteps above them. Someone was walking across the floor. The countdown had stopped. The computer screen changed. Midnight. Nothing happened. The investigators waited. Then the lights turned on. A speaker in the ceiling activated. The same calm voice spoke again. "Now you understand." The investigator shouted. "Who are you?" Silence. Then, "You've spent years looking for a monster." A pause. "But you never asked who created the monster." The investigator demanded a name. The voice answered, "Names are temporary." Daniel stepped toward the speaker. "Where is Michael?" The voice became silent. Then answered, "Closer than you think." Daniel froze. The investigator asked, "Where?" No answer. Instead, a monitor switched on. It displayed a live video. A man was sitting in a dark room. Older, thin, but recognizable. Daniel whispered, "Michael." Michael looked directly into the camera. He appeared alive. He looked exhausted. Then he said, "Daniel, don't trust him." The screen went black. Daniel stepped backward. The investigator asked, "Where was that?" Daniel shook his head. "I don't know." Then the voice returned. "Now you have a choice." The investigator looked toward the speaker. "What choice?" "You can leave." A pause. "Or you can find the others." Daniel asked, "Where?" The voice answered, "Follow the road." The monitors displayed a map. A route appeared. It led away from the forest, toward an abandoned town several hours away. Then another message appeared. "Michael is waiting." The investigator looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the map. For the first time since his return, he smiled. Not because he was happy, because he finally believed Michael might still be alive. They left the underground room. But before leaving, the investigator turned back toward the monitors. One screen was still active. It showed the forest, the cabin, the old road, and a figure standing beside the trees. The figure raised one hand, a light-colored glove. Then the screen went black. The map remained on the screen. A single route led away from the forest, toward an abandoned town several hours away. And at the end of that route was one name, Michael Rowan. Daniel stared at the screen. For years, he had believed Michael might be dead. Now there was proof that someone wanted them to believe he was alive. But proof was not the same thing as certainty. The investigators left the underground room and returned to the surface. The forest looked completely different in daylight. For the first time, Daniel could see the trees without the darkness surrounding them. He stopped at the edge of the road. "I remember this place," the investigator asked. "From when?" Daniel pointed toward the distance. "Michael and I came through here." They followed the route from the map. The road became narrower. The forest gradually disappeared behind them. After several hours, they reached an abandoned town. There were empty houses, a closed gas station, an old motel, a small church, and a railway line that had not been used in years. The investigators checked the map. One building was circled, an old warehouse near the railway. Daniel looked at it. That's where he used to take people. The investigators stopped. "Who?" Daniel looked at the warehouse. "The man." They approached carefully. The building appeared abandoned. The windows were broken. The doors were rusted. There were no vehicles outside, no lights, no obvious signs of life. Inside, the air smelled of dust and damp wood. The investigators searched the ground floor. Nothing. Then Daniel noticed something on the wall. 3 lines. The same symbol. He moved toward it. Behind the symbol was a hidden latch. A section of wall opened. Another passage. The investigators entered. The tunnel beneath the warehouse was older than the ones in the forest. It extended beneath the town. There were rooms on both sides, some empty. Others still contained furniture. Daniel stopped at one doorway. "This is where I stayed." The investigator looked at him. "You were here?" Daniel nodded. "Before the forest." He explained that the man had moved him between different locations. The forest was only one part of the network. The abandoned town was another. There were several places, some in rural areas, some near highways, some inside abandoned buildings. The investigators asked how many. Daniel said, "I stopped counting." They continued deeper. Then they heard something, a faint metallic sound, a door closing. The investigators moved quickly. They reached the end of the tunnel. There was a small room, a chair, a table, a lamp, and a man sitting with his back toward them. Daniel stopped breathing. The man slowly turned. It was Michael. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Daniel stepped forward. "Michael." Michael stood. He looked older, much older, but he was unmistakably alive. The 2 men stared at each other. Then Daniel walked toward him. They embraced. Neither spoke. The investigators remained silent. After decades of uncertainty, the 2 missing men had finally been reunited. Michael eventually sat down. He looked exhausted. The investigators asked him, "How long have you been here?" Michael answered, "Not long." "How long?" 3 weeks. They asked who had brought him there. Michael said. No one. He had been searching for the man himself. He had followed clues from the forest. He believed Daniel was alive. He had been trying to find him. The investigators asked, "Did you know Daniel had escaped?" Michael shook his head. "No." "Then how did you know where to look?" Michael pointed toward the table. There was a photograph. It showed Daniel entering the forest, taken only days before his disappearance. Michael had found the photograph years earlier. He had spent decades trying to understand it. Then he said something unexpected. "The man wanted me to find Daniel." The investigators looked at him. "Why?" Michael shook his head. "I don't know." Michael explained that the mysterious man had contacted him several times. Not directly, through notes, photographs, phone calls from unknown numbers, messages with no sender. The messages always contained the same idea. "You're getting closer." Michael had believed the man was leading him somewhere, perhaps into a trap, perhaps toward Daniel. The investigators asked why Michael had not contacted police. He looked at them. "Because I didn't know which police were real." Daniel understood. The same fear, the same uncertainty. Michael then pulled a folder from beneath the table. Inside were documents, names, financial records, property records, and photographs. He placed one document on the table. It showed payments made to several companies. The same companies appeared in the forest records. The investigators immediately recognized some of the names. The operation was not controlled by one person. Money had been moving through multiple businesses. Some were legitimate, some were fake, and some had disappeared years ago. Michael explained that he believed the man was only one part of the system. A person who watched, tracked, threatened, but someone else provided money. Someone else provided access. Someone else protected the identities. The investigators asked, "Who?" Michael looked at Daniel, then said, "I found a name." He placed another document on the table. The name was not Victor, not Samuel, not Elias, not the mysterious man. It belonged to someone who had never appeared in the forest photographs. Someone who had remained completely invisible. The investigators read the name, then looked at Michael. "Are you sure?" Michael nodded. "I spent years checking it." Daniel picked up the document. He read it. His expression changed. He had seen the name before. Not in the forest. Not in a photograph. In a document the mysterious man had shown him years earlier. Daniel whispered, "That's who he worked for." Before the investigators could ask another question, the lights went out. Michael immediately stood. "He's here." The investigators raised their flashlights. A sound came from the tunnel. Footsteps. Slow. Approaching. Daniel looked at Michael. "How did he find us?" Michael shook his head. "He always knows." The footsteps stopped outside the room. Then came 3 knocks. Knock. 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 Nobody answered. A voice came through the door. Calm. Almost friendly. "You found each other." Daniel closed his eyes. Michael whispered, "Don't listen." The voice continued, "You spent all these years searching for the truth." A pause. "Now you have it," the investigators demanded. "Show yourself." The voice laughed softly. "You already know my face." A photograph slid beneath the door. The investigator picked it up. It showed Daniel and Michael together, taken only minutes earlier. On the back were 5 words. "Now find the person above me." The investigators looked at the document Michael had found. The hidden financier. The person above the mysterious man. Then the building shook. A loud metallic sound echoed through the tunnel. Dust fell from the ceiling. Michael shouted, "Move!" Everyone rushed toward the opposite passage. Behind them, smoke began filling the room. The mysterious man had started something. And this time, he wasn't trying to scare them. He was trying to erase the evidence. Smoke was spreading through the tunnel. Michael grabbed Daniel by the arm. "Move!" They ran. Behind them, flames began climbing the walls of the underground room. The investigators rushed through the narrow passage, trying to find another exit. The smoke became thicker. Daniel coughed. Michael pointed ahead. There! A faint light was visible at the end of the tunnel. They reached a metal staircase. The stairs led upward. One investigator pushed the hatch. It wouldn't move. Locked. He tried again. Nothing. Michael looked around. There has to be another way. The smoke was getting worse. Daniel suddenly noticed something carved into the wall. 3 lines. He pressed the symbol. A hidden panel opened. Behind it was another staircase. They climbed. The hatch above opened into an abandoned building. They emerged into the night air. Everyone collapsed outside, coughing. Behind them, smoke poured from the building. The investigator looked back. The warehouse was burning. Within minutes, flames were spreading through the roof. Whatever had been stored underground was being destroyed. But Michael still had the folder. He had managed to keep the documents. That meant the evidence had survived. They moved away from the building. The investigators immediately contacted emergency services. Firefighters arrived. The fire was eventually contained, but the underground rooms were heavily damaged. Many documents were destroyed. Many photographs disappeared. The investigators returned to the folder. They examined every page. The name of the person above the mysterious man was still visible. So were several financial transactions, and one property address. The address was not in the forest. It was in a major city, a large private residence. The property belonged to a wealthy businessman, someone who had been publicly respected for decades. The investigators searched his history. At first, nothing appeared suspicious. Charitable donations, business investments, political connections, community projects. Everything looked legitimate, too legitimate. Then they discovered something. One of his companies had purchased several pieces of land around the forest. The purchases had happened years before the disappearances. Some properties had been bought through other companies, but all the companies eventually led back to the same financial network. Michael said, "That's him." The investigator asked, "You're sure?" Michael nodded. "I saw his name." Daniel remained silent. He looked frightened. The investigator asked why. Daniel finally said, "Because I met him." Everyone turned toward him. "When?" Daniel explained that during his captivity, the mysterious man had taken him to a meeting. Daniel had been blindfolded. He couldn't see the location, but he remembered the voice. He remembered the smell of the room. He remembered a distinctive watch. And most importantly, he remembered the man's name. Daniel said it quietly. The investigator looked at the document. It was the same name. The wealthy businessman was not simply funding the operation. He had personally met the people involved. The investigators prepared a warrant. But before they could move, Michael stopped them. "You can't go there." "Why?" "Because that's exactly what he wants." Michael explained. The businessman had anticipated investigations. He had lawyers, security, connections. If police approached without enough evidence, everything would disappear. They needed more. Michael opened the folder again. There was one final document, a property map. It showed another building, a private estate outside the city, but beneath the estate was a tunnel. The investigator stared at it. "Another tunnel?" Michael nodded. "They're everywhere." The network wasn't confined to one forest. The tunnels were connected to properties across the region. The forest had simply been one of the largest. Daniel said, "That's where he keeps the real records." The investigators asked how he knew. Daniel answered, "Because that's where he took me the last time I saw him." The plan changed. They would not confront the businessman immediately. First, they would investigate the estate. Later that night, a surveillance team arrived near the property. The estate was enormous. A large house stood behind high walls. Security cameras covered the entrance. Several vehicles were parked outside. The investigators watched. Nothing unusual happened. Then, at approximately 2 a.m., a vehicle left the property. The surveillance team followed. The vehicle drove toward the old forest. The investigators watched from a distance. The vehicle stopped near the old service road. A man stepped out. He opened the trunk. Inside were several boxes. The investigators zoomed in. The man was wearing dark clothing, and on one hand, a light-colored glove. The mysterious man had returned. The investigators followed him through the trees. He entered the forest, then disappeared underground. The team waited. Minutes passed. Then the man emerged carrying a small metal case. He placed it inside the vehicle. The investigators moved in. "Police! Don't move!" The man froze. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then he slowly turned. The flashlight beam hit his face. It was the same man from the photographs. The same man Daniel had described. The same man who had haunted the forest for decades. The investigator shouted, "Hands where we can see them." The man raised his hands. But he smiled. Not fear, not surprise, a calm smile. The investigator approached. "You're under arrest." The man looked at him, then said, "You still don't understand." "What?" The man glanced toward the forest. "You're arresting the wrong person." The investigators opened the metal case. Inside were photographs, documents, passports, and dozens of names. One photograph showed Daniel. Another showed Michael. Another showed Victor. Another showed Elias. And another showed the investigator standing outside the forest. But the last photograph was different. It showed the wealthy businessman, standing beside the mysterious man. And behind them stood someone else. Daniel recognized the third person immediately. His expression changed. "That's impossible." The investigator asked, "Who is it?" Daniel whispered, "The person who told me Victor was dead." The investigator looked at the photograph again. The third person wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had been part of the investigation from the beginning. Someone who had supposedly been helping them. Someone they had trusted. The mysterious man smiled. "You finally found the door." He looked toward the forest. "But you still haven't found the person holding the key." Then, somewhere in the darkness behind them, a vehicle engine started.